Born in Glasgow, Scotland in 1964, at age 40 he's already written 6 books. Niall Ferguson currently teaches financial history at the Stern School of Business at New York University, and he'll join the Harvard History Department this July. His books include The House of Rothschild, Empire, The Rise and Demise of the British World Order, and his newest publication, Colossus, The Price of America's Empire. Join the conversation on Book TV for the next 3 hours. In depth, Niall Ferguson.
Niall Ferguson, some have called your work alternative history. How do you define that?
Well, alternative history, or perhaps counterfactual history would be more accurate, is a kind of history which takes into account not only what did happen, but what might have happened. In a sense, it's to ask the what-if questions that historians for many generations felt they should never ask.
And some still do.
And some still feel it's not what we ought to do, that it's not our business to ask what might have been. Well, I passionately believe that you cannot understand causation in the past until you've examined the alternatives that were very real to contemporaries. Say in 1940, what if Britain had made peace with Hitler? Many people advocated that. Well, what exactly would have happened? That seems to me to be very much the kind of question that historians should address, and I try to address those questions in my work.
It is not your most recent book, but this one was all about that whole issue of counterfactual history. This book, Virtual History, when did it come out?
Well, it came out, I think, in '97 in Great Britain, but there was a long lag before it got published here, and I had a sense that Americans were rather less receptive to the idea back in the mid-90s of what-if history. It took several years to persuade an American publisher, Basic, to publish it. But it was a manifesto for this approach to history, and the introduction, something of which I'm still rather proud, because it sets out very clearly the rules of engagement for asking this kind of question. It's not just after-dinner humour. It's a very serious business, asking what might have been. And you have to make sure that you only consider realistic or plausible alternatives. And my rule number 1 was simply, it has to be an alternative people at the time saw as realistic, that they talked about. Therefore, you have some evidence. You can see, for example, what the Germans planned to do in the event of a victory in World War II, and that's one of the chapters, in fact, 2 of the chapters in the book address that question.
Why have you decided, intellectually, why have you decided to go this route with your work?
Well, it's a story that dates back to my very earliest research. In fact, my doctoral thesis was about hyperinflation. I know that sounds terribly technical and boring, but in fact, it was about hyperinflation in post-First World War Germany, which, after all, is a tremendously important subject, because in many ways the origins of Nazism, of Hitler's rise to power, lie in this huge crisis that afflicts Germany in the early 1920s. And I wrote a book about this and spent the usual 5 years of my life thinking about virtually nothing else. And when the book came out, I found myself engaged in quite a heated controversy with one of the grand old men of German economic history, because what the book argues is that there was an alternative, that Germany didn't need to go through this hell of complete monetary collapse, and that therefore, in a sense, there was another path which German history could have taken. And I remember getting a terrifying 10 or 12-page single-space letter from this grand old man saying, this is all completely illegitimate. It is simply wrong to argue about what might have been. And I remember sitting down and thinking, is this the end of my academic career? And I decided no. It was actually the beginning of a campaign to persuade him and many, many other scholars that these questions aren't just good questions, they're necessary questions.
Who have you persuaded?
I have no idea if I've persuaded anybody, although one indicator of success is that there have been a great many imitators of virtual history published in the last 8 or so years. And I think the success of spin-offs edited by other historians like Robert Cowley and Andrew Roberts is a measure of at least some progress. It's much harder than it used to be to say, as many academic historians did, we just don't do that. I think I've made that more difficult to do, and I hope, although it's a hope rather than a certainty, I hope that gradually this approach to history will become more standard, so that people studying history in college, instead of just occasionally playing with a what-if question, will always think to themselves, whatever the question they're addressing, what if the British had acted differently in the War of Independence? What if the French hadn't been there at Yorktown? These are questions that seem to me to be A, tremendously exciting, but B, really necessary if we're to understand what did happen.
But you know you have a lot of critics.
Well, critics are what one wants. The last thing one wants is to be ignored. And the most important thing to remember about history is that it's an argument. And one stakes out a position, one tries to make a case, and then one hopes that people will criticize it. The only question is, will they succeed? Will they in fact disprove the hypothesis? Will they manage to reject the argument? I have many critics. I can't think of many who've successfully destroyed an argument I've made.
Let me have you listen to one of them recently. Hugh Strachan has a new book out on World War I. Your book on World War I, The Pity of War, came out prior to that. We'll show our viewers what the cover looked like, in which you did one called Explaining World War I. Hugh Strachan spoke recently in Washington, D.C., and he didn't name you, but your name did come up. This is what he had to say.
I'm certainly not one of those, like a certain other British historian who now peddles his trade on this side of the Atlantic, who would argue that this Anglo-German antagonism was a case of sort of mistaken identity, that this was a war that could be avoided. I think it's much more fundamental than that. And that in the end, for Britain, for example, people say, why did Britain go into this war? And the answer is, for Britain, imperial security was at stake. For Britain, the empire and Britain, the home islands, were one and the same thing. And the danger of an overmighty power on the continent, the loss of continental allies, those things were simply unacceptable.
Well, I have huge respect for Hugh Strachan, or Strachan, of course, is how he should pronounce his name, although he's a rather anglicised Scot, so he pronounces it Strachan.
Mm-hmm.
As an historian, I think he's one of the leading figures in First World War scholarship. However, I mean, I reviewed his first volume of what will doubtless be a monumental, certainly vast history of the war, and I felt as I read it that what it had to say about the origins of the war was really far from original, and it certainly was very far from disproving my case. The key point in The Pity of War about Britain's decision for war is that it's contradictory. If he's right, if what Hugh Strachan said there is correct, and Britain had a vital interest in preventing German hegemony on continental Europe, then why did the British not introduce conscription and build up an army equal to the Germans prior to 1914? They didn't. Instead, the Liberals did something completely contradictory, which was to leave the British army tiny, far too small to deter the Germans, while at the same time making commitments to France and to Russia that amounted to a pledge to intervene in a war. Now, what The Pity of War says is that that was the worst possible combination. They had two clear and coherent alternatives. One, no conscription, stay out the war, neutrality. Two, commit yourself to fighting the Germans, but build up your defense forces so that you really can take them on. And my argument is that the middle position, no conscription but a commitment to fight the Germans, was contradictory and disastrous for Britain. I mean, it cost Britain vastly more to do that than either of the alternatives would have. And I don't think, to be frank, that Hugh Strachan is really engaging with our argument in a satisfactory way.
These are your two most recent books. Empire, 2003?
Yes, last year.
2003, and then your brand new book for 2004, Colossus, The Price of American Empire. Again, most of your work recently has all developed around this word and this term and this thought process of empire. First of all, how do you define it?
Well, an empire is something that can project from the borders of the homeland economic, cultural, social, and military power. Let's define it as broadly as that. I think in all of history there have been probably in the neighborhood of 60 or 70 empires, and I argue that the United States is one such, and it's an empire quite like, although not entirely like, the British Empire of, say, a century ago. That's to say, it's fundamentally interested in globalizing the economy, integrating markets, free flows of capital, but it's also committed to the spread of certain institutions, certain notions about how countries should be governed, how their legal systems should function. And unlike most empires, both the British and the American empire aspired to export representative government. In some way, over some time frame, the idea was that ultimately everybody should get a share in this particular system of government. So that would be my definition of empire. It's quite an elastic one. If you define empire too narrowly, if you just say, oh, it's about controlling foreign territory, but not letting the people there have any say, then you end up with a very small American empire, which is really Puerto Rico, Guam, and a few island bases in the Pacific. But a broader definition, like the one that I think most historians of the British Empire have used for decades, which looks at economic forces, looks at migration patterns, looks at cultural dominance, the extent to which a culture can be exported beyond a nation's borders. That broader definition, I think, makes the United States very clearly an empire, and indeed one of history's most powerful empires.
There are a lot of people in the political world who don't like this word empire. How did it get its bad name?
Well, it's quite interesting that from the President of the United States down, imperial denial is a phenomenon in American political life.
Why do you think that is?
I think that has its origins not so much in the War of Independence. People usually say, oh, it's because the United States threw off the British imperial yoke. They're allergic to the E-word, empire. But actually that's not right, because as I tried to show in Colossus, the Founding Fathers frequently spoke of the United States as an empire in the making. And indeed they saw the expansion of the independent colonies across the North American continent as an imperial project. No, I think anti-imperialism in American public life is of much more recent origin. I think it can be traced back perhaps as far as the war in the Philippines after the 1898 war with Spain. That went quite badly wrong, and figures like Mark Twain led a very passionate anti-imperial campaign. But of course it's Vietnam, really, that shapes our anti-imperial prejudices today. It's the sense that in many ways the 1960s saw a failed American imperial project, and of course that anti-imperial rhetoric that the left used so effectively in the 1960s against the United States has left its mark, and today nobody wants to be associated with American imperialism, except a tiny number of radical neoconservatives whose influence, I think, is waning rapidly.
Are you one of those conservatives?
Well, I don't think I am quite. I mean, apart from anything else, I'm an import. I mean, I'm from a very different political culture, and even in Britain it's quite hard to categorise me politically. People have often said, oh, he's a conservative. But in fact, I'm a liberal fundamentalist in the sense that my origins lie in 19th century Victorian liberalism. And if I have a view of empire, it's very much a liberal view of empire. And I don't subscribe to the rather messianic, optimistic view of many neoconservatives that with one almighty flash of shock and awe you can democratize the Middle East, or for that matter the world. I mean, President Bush is currently committed to an entirely revolutionary project to democratize the entire world. There's nothing conservative about that. So quite what neo means in this context, I don't know. Non-conservative would be a more accurate way of describing what is, in effect, a very revolutionary program. And I wouldn't identify myself with that. I'm more a realist. I'm more, I think, somebody who would argue that we should strive for improving global governance, partly out of self-interest, and partly because the people who live under tyranny and in failed states are the principal losers. They have been losers, if you like, of the decolonization process, because, say, in sub-Saharan Africa, they're much more exploited by the likes of Robert Mugabe than they were under British rule. So I think there's a moral imperative there. But I think one has to be realistic. This is a very difficult thing to do. Our system of law, our system of government, our system of economic organization is not something you just transplant in a matter of months. It takes decades, perhaps as long as a century, for these institutions to take root in foreign soil. And anybody who is committed to the idea, whether you call it imperial or whether you call it something quite different, of a transformation of the global economy and even of global governance, has to be realistic. It's really, really difficult. There will be resistance, and it may take decades, even longer, to achieve.
On the first Sunday of every month, we bring you from Book TV a program called In Depth. It is a 3-hour program in which we ask an author who has a body of work to come and sit down, talk about their work, their life, and to take your phone calls. And that's what we're doing today with Niall Ferguson. You'll learn more about him as the time goes on, but we wanted to break and tell you how you can participate in the program if you like. We've divided the lines this way. If you are familiar with Mr. Ferguson's work and you read it on a regular basis, you know his book Colossus and Empire, or you've read The Pity of War, you have one line where you can talk to Mr. Ferguson, and that line is 202-585-3890. If you're not familiar with his work, but you'd like to know more about what he does and what he writes about, 202-585-3891. You most recently wrote a piece in the New York Times about what's going on today with Iraq and the whole argument of whether it is Redux Vietnam. You say no, and you also say that Americans are looking at the wrong time period to really figure out Iraq. Why?
Well, to an outsider, it's amazing that when Americans set out to learn from history, they only really seem to want to learn from American history. In fact, American history doesn't give you many examples of interventions in the Middle East, certainly of successful interventions in the Middle East. One can think of disastrous ones like Lebanon in the early 1980s, whereas there are plenty of examples of intervention in the Middle East in British history. So the key point in the piece was simply to say, don't waste your time looking for analogies with Vietnam. That was part of the Cold War. It was a very, very big war with 20,000 plus killed in action before popular support dipped below 50%. And it needs to be understood as a quite different undertaking from the one that's currently going on, which has much more to do with what the British did after the First World War in Iraq, in precisely the same place.
Make that connection and talk about what happened then.
Well, in 1917, towards the end of the First World War, the British Army arrived in Baghdad having defeated the Turks. Iraq at that point was part of the Ottoman Turkish Empire. And the British general in command proclaimed to the people of Baghdad, and I quote, "We come not as conquerors, but as liberators." Sound familiar? So the British project of, as it were, liberating Iraq, rather like the American project to democratize it today, amounted to a temporary imposition of English-speaking occupation. That's what happened. After 1917, the British essentially tried to rule Iraq as part of their empire, as a sort of mini-me India. It went wrong. 1920, full-scale revolt in the middle of that year. And interestingly, it happened after the British had brought in the then equivalent of the United Nations, the League of Nations. Before the revolt, the British had said, it's okay, it's not a colony, it's a mandate. We're going to run it for the League of Nations as a part of a transition to independence. It didn't suffice. There was still a revolt against their presence.
What kind of revolt? I mean, what did it look like?
Well, a revolt very like the one we've seen in Iraq these past few weeks. That's to say, it was both Sunni and Shiite Iraqis, and indeed, interestingly, some Kurds who rose up and took arms against the British occupiers. Interestingly, it began in a religious context. It was religious leaders in mosques in Baghdad and elsewhere who denounced the infidel, the occupier. And in that sense, there's such a close resemblance that it's quite uncanny. I mean, there was a figure exactly like Muqtada al-Sadr then, who was essentially the firebrand igniting the rebellion. Interestingly also, the British, like the United States today, didn't really have enough troops on the ground to cope. In fact, they had roughly the same number of troops, almost exactly the same number of troops that the US has in Iraq today, which in relation to the population was actually rather more than we have today. Control was lost. We, in the middle of 1920, had very indignant questions in the House of Commons, panic in the government, what are we going to do? Desperation on the part of the commander on the ground, who actually, and this is a rich irony, called for chemical weapons, gas shells, to be sent to help him quell the rebellion. And in a typical bit of British imperial muddling, it turned out that there weren't any available. So he wasn't able to conduct what would have been horrendous chemical warfare against the insurgents, to use a contemporary term. And in the end, it was in fact Churchill, as Air Minister, who authorised the use of the Royal Air Force to quell the rebellion. And it was quelled decisively in the summer of 1920. By September, October, there was really no significant resistance. Now, the moral of the story, and this was really the point that I made in the New York Times that upset many people, was that firm action against the rebellion was necessary at this point if you want to lay a foundation for a transition to Iraqi independence, because the British did that. After the rebellion had been quelled, they handed over power to King Faisal, who was a sort of British-style constitutional monarch, or so they hoped. And gradually, over a period of about a decade, they paved the way for full Iraqi independence. But they kept troops in Iraq until 1955, ensuring that the country remained essentially in the British sphere of influence until that date.
So another 30 years or so.
Right. That's the time frame. And I don't think many Americans, in fact, I'm not sure any Americans fully realize that a time frame that is more compressed than that, that says, oh, June 30th, we're done, is not realistic. and is likely to end in potentially in civil war and the emergence of a very anti-American regime in Iraq. And that's what scares me. So the lesson from history that I'm drawing here is that there are big dangers in a loss of will at this point, and one sees it in the American electorate, one sees it even more in the American political elites. It seems to me between the two presidential candidates, there's not a great deal of difference in their policy towards Iraq, which is essentially hand the hot potato to the United Nations and, as far as possible, wind this thing up. Well, it's much too early to do that, and I think if that's attempted this year, there will be a very heavy price to pay in the future.
Where were you born?
I was born in Glasgow. I was born in Glasgow in 1964 in the west of Scotland, a then already declining industrial city, which had, it should be said, once been regarded as the second city of the British Empire. So I grew up in a sort of wasteland left by post-industrialization and decolonisation.
When did you leave there?
When did I leave? Probably the early 80s. I went to university in Oxford, which is emigration to a Scotsman. That was to England. And so I did my high school in Scotland and then went to study in Oxford.
And how did you come about deciding to go into this area?
Well, there was a very difficult choice because in the first place my family was much more a family of scientists. Both my mother and father are trained scientifically. My father's a doctor, my mother's a physicist. They'd studied these subjects at university. And my sister is a physicist, a biophysicist. And so I'm the black sheep because it was obvious fairly early on that I wasn't really going to be a great success in the laboratory. I was drawn to the more literary subjects, to what we used to call the arts, and had to make a choice at some point between studying English literature, or perhaps literature generally, and studying history. And funnily enough, it was a work of literature that swung it. I think Tolstoy's War and Peace was the book that persuaded me in my, I suppose, last couple of years at high school to become a historian rather than to study literature.
Some have talked about how you integrate literature into your work. Why do you do that? And why is it important for you to do that?
Well, you could give a cynical answer to that and say, well, it's the sugar on the pill, because some of what Ferguson does is quite hard-edged economic history, and not everybody finds that easy to swallow, and a few literary allusions help the pill go down. But that would be too facile. I think the reason is that I'm absolutely committed to trying to recapture the experience of the past in its own terms, and not to impose, as it were, anachronistic judgments on past events. One of the best ways of making sure that you are understanding the past in its own terms is to hear the voice of contemporaries. And of course, when you are looking for the voice of contemporaries in the 19th century, of course the most powerful voices, the voices that resonate most, the people whom it's a delight to quote, are the great writers. When I was writing the history of Rothschilds, I was incredibly lucky to find that a huge number of 19th century novelists had alluded to the Rothschild family in their work. Balzac, Heine, Zola, and in that sense, I could go to these authors and go to their books and find tremendously vivid evocations of the Rothschilds as their contemporaries saw them. And in that sense, I think literature is a way not to necessarily get an exactly scientific version of what the past was like, but to give at least a flavour of how it seemed to a certain kind of man or woman at the time.
You brought up the Rothschilds. Here are the two books, but it's one series. How does that work?
Well, it's a funny story actually, because it was originally supposed to be one volume, and indeed it was published in hardcover in England in one volume. But this volume's so huge that it's more a weapon than a book, and I think the view was taken that American wrists might not be able to withstand the weight of a single volume. So it was split in two. To my great delight, I always felt it should be two volumes, and felt the one-volume edition was just a monster.
We asked you to come up with a list of people who you thought were the most influential people in history, and two of those people actually come from the Rothschild family. Here is a picture of Nathan Rothschild. Why did you choose him as one of the most influential people in history?
Right. Well, that may sound surprising, but as a financial historian, my core competence is the history of finance. I passionately believe that we as a profession, historical profession, underestimate the importance of bankers and overestimate the importance of politicians. And for some reason, kings and prime ministers get the top billing, or presidents get the top billing. And the guys who actually shape our modern financial world really are in the B movie. They're in the trailer if they're there at all. Now, Nathan Rothschild, or Nathan Rothschild, as he of course was originally known in Frankfurt, in the ghetto where he grew up, was the most powerful and innovative banker of the early 19th century. Transformed the world of finance, I think can be credited with creating the international bond market that we know today. And in the 19th century, the Rothschild Bank, which he built, I mean, he was the man who really turned them into the biggest bank in the world with a series of spectacular financial deals. He was the guy who created an institution more powerful in terms of resources than most of the governments of that era. And in many ways, the Rothschild book, which I think is the book of which I'm most proud, makes a very plausible argument that we need to regard the Rothschild Bank as being more important than most of the nation states of the 19th century, that it was really the gatekeeper to international financial markets. And any politician, Bismarck, Metternich, Disraeli, Gladstone, any politician who wanted to take a decision, particularly one that implied perhaps war, had to take the Rothschild view into account. Because if the Rothschild said, you're not going to be able to float a loan, I'm afraid, the stock market is closed to you, then your position was essentially closed. From that point of view, I think Nathan deserves to be ranked up there with Napoleon, actually. He was called the Bonaparte of finance by contemporaries. And I think when you study him and his contribution, it starts to seem a plausible case.
You had Alfred on that list too, I think.
Alfred I wouldn't rate as highly.
You wouldn't?
The other Rothschild that I would rate as highly would be James.
Oh, James.
James was little brother. James was the little brother who, in many ways, had Nathan's genius and temperament. But because he was born later, because he was a rather more sophisticated man in his education, James was able to take the story further, lived longer, lived into the 1860s. And James's vision of an integrated Europe, based not only on financial integration, but on a railway network that was going to stretch literally from London across the Channel all the way to Eastern Europe. This was an amazingly modern vision. And James was a real financial genius, an extraordinary man. And I suppose I rather grew to love them because I read their letters. The whole book is based on this extraordinary corpus of correspondence. They wrote to one another day in and day out. Tremendously fiery, earthy, fascinating letters, which mix business and pleasure and politics. And in a sense, I immersed myself in their world while I wrote that book. And the more I did, the more I began to see that they were absolutely crucial figures who deserved to be mentioned in the same breath as Lincoln, as 19th century figures of truly global stature.
We are also going to take your email questions today if you would like to join us in that way. The address is booktv@cspan.org, and we'll get as many on as we can of that. Let's take our first call. It's from Somerville, Massachusetts. Hello.
Good morning, Professor Ferguson.
Good morning.
Let me turn down my TV.
Thank you.
I have a question for you regarding the relationship between the Attlee government and the United States and Truman in the immediate post-war. After Churchill was removed, what became the relationship between the United States government and the British government after they decided to ditch their empire and create the social state? Did this provide friction between the two? And what was the relationship between the Attlee government and Truman administration during the Korean War?
Well, it's an interesting question because in many ways American policy had already fairly firmly decided that in the post-war period the British Empire should be broken up. That had been Franklin Roosevelt's position, and he never concealed from Churchill his belief that after 1945, after the end of the war, the British Empire should be wound up, and Churchill never concealed from Roosevelt his belief that this was quite wrong. Well, when it came to the crunch, as you rightly point out, neither Roosevelt nor Churchill was there to decide. Roosevelt had died, and Churchill had been defeated in a landslide election victory by the Labour Party in 1945. So it fell to Attlee and Truman, lesser men, I think, by most people's standards, certainly lesser men in the eyes of Churchill. Attlee, I think here I would slightly disagree with what you say. I don't think Attlee felt that building the welfare state necessarily implied the breakup of the empire. And indeed, in many ways, his Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, was as committed to keeping the empire in business as Churchill had been. So the British set out to try and do both. I mean, I think both was really their strategy. We can perhaps wind up some positions. India, that clearly was going to be wound up, and very quickly they found their position in Palestine unsustainable. But in Africa, in other parts of Asia, the intention was to keep the show on the road, and particularly in the Middle East, which was seen as strategically now the most important part of the empire. The problem was very simple. This could only happen if the United States was prepared to finance it, because Britain was bankrupt, bust. The cost of World War II left Britain completely bust. If the United States had said, fine, if Truman had said, fine, we need the British Empire, it's actually a bulwark against potential threats from, say, the Soviet Union. Therefore, we'll keep Lend-Lease going, we'll finance your deficit, we'll keep you on the road until such times as you've stabilized. Then I think it would have been a viable scenario. But unfortunately, the American position was, as soon as the war was over, that's it. The money's not going to flow anymore. And in that sense, it was the United States that proclaimed the bankruptcy of the British Empire, and I think forced the Labour government to dismantle the empire, and indeed forced its conservative successors to dismantle the empire much faster than anybody had intended.
Fort Lauderdale, you're next with Niall Ferguson. Hello.
Yes, good morning. I want to say I'm enjoying immensely Mr. Ferguson's discourse on everything he's talked about. The question that I have for you is directed to you as a financial historian. I'd like you, if possible, to characterize the role that European bankers, perhaps the Rothschilds, perhaps others, have presently in world affairs, specifically as it relates to power over governments, i.e. the U.S. government, et cetera. Thank you.
Well, it's a fascinating question. There are many people in the world today who still believe that the Rothschild family has a great and possibly sinister power. And I hate to disabuse them, but it simply ain't so, and I think the Rothschilds would be the first to concede this. Compared with the power that bank wielded a century ago, it's now really quite a small operation with a Swiss, London, Paris base that really can't be said to have any political leverage comparable with the leverage it had back in the 19th century. If you broaden out the question, as I think you did, to European bankers in general, I think there's a slightly different argument that one can make. And that is that if you look at the United States' dependence on foreign capital today, the enormous inflows of finance from not only from Europe, also from East Asia, that are necessary to allow Americans to consume as they consume, to borrow as they borrow, to run a current account deficit of now more than 5% of gross domestic product, then I think that one can argue there is some real power there. But I think it's a power that's shared between a great many European institutions, and in many ways the most interesting one to watch here is the European Central Bank itself. Because I think the European Central Bank, and this is something of a hidden story, it hasn't really been spotted here. The European Central Bank has done something very, very important. It's created a rival currency to the dollar. The euro is now in many ways as important a currency in the world as the United States dollar. And I think in that sense, we're actually approaching a crossroads in financial history, comparable with the one when the dollar overtook the pound after the First World War.
That viewer might be interested in this book, The Cash Nexus, which came out when?
The Cash Nexus was published in, 2001. And
all about money and power.
And it was designed to take some of the ideas of the Rothschild book, which had been focused very much on that one bank, and apply them more generally, and essentially to say, you know, financial institutions are really important in history. We can't actually understand the history of the modern world till we look at the way banks, stock markets, currency systems operate. It was really a plea for historians to take the economy seriously and not to leave it to economists. In fact, economics is much too important to be left to economists.
Los Angeles, hello.
Well, Professor Ferguson, have you heard of the article by Professor Kevin McDonald out of Cal State University, Long Beach? It's called Thinking About Neoconservatism. And you had mentioned that the Iraq War was based on democracy and promoting such by these neoconservatives. And Professor Ferguson, or actually Professor McDonald, Kevin McDonald, had mentioned that it was basically just cover to promote this Zionist extremist neoconservative movement to basically control the region and neutralize Israel's enemies. The second question I had quickly is you had mentioned the Rothschild situation. What about with the Bellflower Agreement, how a deal was made with the British government apparently to finance how bankrupt the British government was at the end of World War I, and in return, Palestine was given to the European Jews who had no ancestral connection to Palestine at all. And thirdly, you said that the Rothschild family has no relevance. What about the Khodorkovsky, who was a Russian Jew aligned with Israel, and Yukos has just been taken over by the Rothschilds?
Well, I really have to take those questions quite carefully in order, but I'll answer them briefly. I don't know Kevin MacDonald's article, although I think I'm familiar with the argument that you're associating with it. And I think one has to be quite careful here because, of course, the only meaningful democracy in the Middle East is Israel's. So in a sense, it's quite hard to make the distinction that you've just made between a pro-Israeli policy and a pro-democracy policy. I don't think they actually can be separated, and I don't think that they are distinct in what neoconservatives today would advocate. I think the second point about the relationship between the Rothschild family and the creation of the State of Israel is a very important one because they played a huge role and nobody would deny that. After all, the Balfour Declaration was actually a letter to, or it came in the form of a letter to the second Lord Rothschild, who had been extremely important in the campaign to issue a declaration that there would be a homeland for the Jews in Palestine. I don't think anybody would deny that the Rothschilds were crucial in this. But it's worth remembering that the Rothschild family itself was divided on this subject. Some were Zionists. The second Lord Rothschild wasn't. He wanted Palestine to be a British colony with a Jewish settlement inside it. And they debated about this quite fiercely within the family. Your third question about what's going on in the Russian oil industry, I think, is more easily dealt with. I don't think one could claim for a second that the Rothschilds have a significant role in the grand story of the privatization of Russian mineral resources, although privatization was something that Rothschilds certainly pioneered in the 1980s. That story is much more a story about the way in which not only under the influence of European banks, but also under the influence of American experts, a very hasty privatization took place in the wake of the collapse of communism that allowed very rapid concentrations of power in the Russian economy to emerge. So I think we should be very careful about attributing that to the Rothschild Bank.
Doug Wills, one of our viewers, has this email. I read that you were working on a history of the bond markets. Is that correct, and how's the research going?
Well, actually, that's true, but in a way, the Cash Nexus is that history. It's quite a funny story of the way historical research can take you a little bit further than you intended to go. I sat down after the Rothschild book to write a history of the bond market, which was a subject calculated to make most human beings fall unconscious with boredom. And I went off to the Bank of England for a year, a wonderful year as a research fellow there, and I'm very indebted to the people at the Bank of England for that time and for what they taught me. And as the year wore on, I decided that I couldn't really just write the history of the bond market. I had to explain why governments needed to issue bonds, and that meant I had to look at government expenditure, taxation. I had to look at the evolution of systems of public debt. And once I'd done that, I thought, well, I've only just scratched the surface of the political implications of this. What does it mean if there's a group of people who are effectively owed money by government? These bondholders, I started to realize they had a crucial role to play in financial history. So the project kind of grew from being simply a history of the bond market into being a much more ambitious history of financial institutions in the large. So I finished it, and it's kind of embedded in the Cash Nexus, right in the middle of it.
Portland, Oregon, hello.
Oh, hello, thank you. I want to ask Mr. Ferguson a question. Number one, it sounds like he has a very economic and political background as well as being a historian. My question was, number one, from your statements you made earlier, doing a comparative analysis on the U.S. occupation and British occupation, and you talked about the June 30th turnover. So are you saying that the U.S. can be expected to be there for a very long time? And if so, could you kind of be more specific and give us an estimate of time you think? And secondly, what part did the Rothschilds play in the World War II and financing the German military? Thank you very much.
Well, the second question is the easy one to answer. No part at all. I think it's fair to say that the Rothschilds lost very, very heavily as a result of Hitler's rise to power. At least one member of the family, in fact, lost her life. And the Rothschilds lost all their assets in Germany and in Austria. So that if they played a part in financing Nazism, it was a reluctant part, in the sense that they had their wealth stolen from them by Hitler. And that continued, of course, when the Nazis invaded France. All the Rothschilds' property that was not mobile was simply seized by Hitler and his lackeys. So that's a straightforward enough answer. The question you ask about the timing of the occupation of Iraq is a really important one to me. I spend a lot of my time thinking about what you might call imperial timeframes. One of the things that's really striking is that whenever President Bush says there's a model for what he's trying to do, he tends to cite the occupation of Germany, West Germany, and Japan after World War II, and say, we proved then that we could build nations and turn rogue regimes into democracies. And I always think when I hear him say this, and he's said it several times now, that he's forgetting how long that took. The formal occupation of West Germany was a 10-year period. Certainly after a year and a half, not much had been achieved there. And of course, American troops are still in West Germany today. Whereas, of course, in Iraq, the time frame seems to be so compressed that even 2 years is regarded as too long by people both in power and in the American electorate. And I do think that's not realistic. Nobody, of course, knows, I certainly don't know, how long the US is going to stick it out in Iraq. But I do know that if the positions wound up very swiftly after June the 30th, if American troop levels are swiftly reduced, I think that country will enter a period of terrible instability, and I don't think the United States will benefit from that at all.
College Station, Texas.
Hello, Niall Ferguson. This is Peter Stolling. I had the pleasure of interviewing Hugh Strawn, and I hope to have that pleasure with you on my book review show. But I'm delighted by what you've said so far. I do have a counterfactual for you, which I think would interest you, and that is, do you think that Britain and America, as we are now, might have stuck together in the 1770s if things had been done a bit differently? And following up, do you think that Britain need have lost her financial lead if she had not mortgaged her economy to pay for the Western Front because she had something like 160% of her GNP in overseas investments in 1914. It was about £4 billion, 2.4 billion GNP. I may even have a follow-on if you can stand it, but I think counterfactualism has great merit. It requires knowledge and judgment, but I think it's really, I would hazard to say, the growth area of history if we're going to reach out to the minds of our citizens.
Well, I hope you're right.
Thank you.
I hope you're right, Peter, and I look forward very much to being on your show and answering your questions at greater length than I can here. In the book Empire, The Rise and Demise of the British World Order, I make a counterfactual argument about Britain's American colonies, and the argument is essentially that this was an avoidable breakdown, because all the British really had to do was to acknowledge the legitimacy of the representative institutions of the 13 colonies and say, okay, we don't actually claim to make all law regarding taxation in Westminster. You have your assemblies, and they should be entitled to make decisions about these questions. And the reason this turned out to be perfectly viable as a policy is that it's what they did for Canada later. It's what they did for Australia. It's what they did for New Zealand. It's what they did for South Africa. In fact, giving responsible government, as it came to be called, to the colonies of British settlement was really the solution to the whole problem of how you prevented those countries, Canada, Australia, etc., from following the American example and simply leaving the empire. I mean, why didn't the United States of Australia proclaim its independence? Why is Canada still associated with the Commonwealth? I think the answer is because the British realized through the terrible mistakes of the 1770s that you just didn't need to be so hard line on this issue, that the principle of who decided on tax policy in the colonies was just not worth fighting a war over. So I think it was very much an avoidable crisis. And in that sense, there are all kinds of fascinating counterfactual implications. Imagine if the War of Independence doesn't happen, if the British say, actually, you're right about no taxation without representation, so effectively we're going to concede that principle to your assemblies. There wouldn't have needed at that point to be the unifying effect of war on the 13 colonies, they would have continued probably to pursue their own rather narrow interests in competition with one another under a broader a British imperial umbrella. I don't think it's hard to imagine a British North America that includes the 13 colonies. It would be a very different British North America in two ways that immediately spring to mind. And one, I think Native Americans would have got a better deal. The British had already done a deal with territory beyond the Appalachians, and I think would have had to stick to it after the 7 Years' War. That was exactly when, in fact, that deal was done. And the second point is that it would have been good news for slaves, because the British abolished slavery in their empire well before the issue came to the boil in the United States. By the 1830s, slavery would have been abolished throughout British America, with all kinds of powerful implications for the history of the North American continent. Your second question,
War, no.
Right? You just you see American history disappear before your very eyes at this point, and if you go back to what Ben Franklin said before the war, which I quote at length, back in the 1760s, he couldn't really understand why the British were stumbling towards this breakdown, because there was an obvious compromise. Adam Smith, the great Scottish economist, said, "There's a compromise we can do here." And it really was political blunder by the North administration that led to this irretrievable breakdown. You asked Peter a question about the Western Front. Let me answer it really quickly. I think it's absolutely crucial that Britain ceased to be the world's banker and became far less of a financial power in the 20th century. But I don't think it was really the First World War that broke Britain as a financial power. I think it was the Second World War. In the 20s, Britain was still the biggest overseas investor in the world, bigger than the United States. But by 1945, then we were bankrupt.
Yakima, Washington. Hello.
Hello. I think I saw you, Mr. Ferguson, a couple days ago on another program, and you mentioned very briefly that you might have said something about an ideological connection between the rise of radical Islam currently and in former generations, both German fascism and Soviet communism. I found that, if I heard it correctly, to be reminiscent of arguments made by Hayek in The Road to Serfdom and in other works like Radical Sun by David Horowitz. Do you agree that there's an ideological connection and maybe tactical connection between these seemingly disparate movements? And I wondered if you could expound on that.
I certainly think that there's a close resemblance between Islamism or radical Islamic fundamentalism and what was called Bolshevism just before and after the 1917 revolution in Russia. And I disagree with those people, and there are many, who talk about Islamo-fascism and make a link between Islamic extremism and fascism, because I think it has much more in common with communism than with fascism. Fascism wasn't really a tremendously revolutionary movement. Fascists wanted to get control of the state and to make existing nation states more powerful than they had been before. Whereas the Bolsheviks were a revolutionary terrorist organization that systematically set about dismantling the institutions of power of Tsarist Russia, and intended, particularly in Trotsky's mind, to achieve a world revolution, not just a Russian revolution. Now, what's interesting about this, I think, is that many people in the United States in around 1917 through into the 1920s took the view that Bolshevism wasn't really a menace, and that indeed it was going to be a regime with which the United States could do business. The Red Scare abated, intervention in the Russian Civil War was called off, and in many ways that turned out to be a major miscalculation. By the late 1940s, 50s, the United States swung to the opposite position of regarding the Soviet Union as a mortal threat to its existence. I think we could see something very similar happening in our own time, because at the moment I think we underestimate the danger posed by radical Islam. Europeans are allowing Islamic extremists to organize within their societies almost completely with impunity. And I think it will take time, but sooner or later we are going to realize that these guys are just as dangerous with their messianic revolutionary ideology as Lenin, Trotsky and Stalin were in their time. And indeed they're revolutionaries because I think Osama bin Laden is very like Lenin, a product of an upper class who defects and connives at the overthrow of the existing order in his own society. His relationship to Saudi Arabia is just like Lenin's relationship to Tsarist Russia. Lenin was a hereditary nobleman, but he decided that the future was with revolution. I think Osama bin Laden has a lot in common with Lenin in that respect.
West Palm Beach.
Hi, thank you for taking my call.
Welcome.
I've read two of your books, the books that you've edited, I believe the What If books, and my great What If, and I hope you can disabuse me of this, but I think that the U.S. lost World War II except for the atomic bomb, that had we evacuated the European continent and left a devastated Germany and a defeatist France there, it wouldn't take Stalin long to march right up to the Atlantic coast. And then at Yalta, FDR secured, after entreating Stalin to invade China and the rest of Asia, and that these two things stopped, froze the Soviet Union in place until it died a natural death. And shouldn't we know more about, Richard Rhodes wrote a beautiful book about the making of the atomic bomb, and shouldn't we know much more about Leo Szilard and how he took that message through London to New York to Einstein to Fermi and built the first atomic pile?
Thanks, Florida.
Well, I have to correct you on one point, sir. I didn't edit What If. I think that was Robert Cowley, and nevertheless, I claim to have originated, or not quite originated, but certainly preceded the What If books. Virtual History was published before What If, and I think also, in many ways, Virtual History is a more rigorous book. It doesn't address that specific question. It does ask a question about what difference it would have made if there had been no atomic bomb. Because Jonathan Haslam wrote an extremely interesting chapter in Virtual History about this, pointing out that Stalin wasn't actually afraid of the atomic bomb, whereas the Americans assumed he would be, and they thought that the explosion at Hiroshima and Nagasaki would scare the Soviets witless. Well, we know from the Russian documents that have come to light since 1991 that Stalin was quite unimpressed and described it, I think, as a toy to frighten children. So the Americans clearly thought they had an ace in the hand, and in fact, in the eyes of Stalin, didn't at all. I agree with the premise of your question. I don't think one can say that the Allies won, certainly not the Western Allies, won the Second World War without a qualifying clause. And the qualifying clause is, but unfortunately they had to win it in partnership with another totalitarian regime, which was Stalin's Soviet Union. And Stalin's Soviet Union claimed as the price of its victory control of precisely those states of Eastern Europe that the War of 39 had been about. In that sense, I don't think the Western Allies had an unqualified victory in Europe, and nor did they really have the victory that the Americans hoped for in Asia. China was supposed to emerge from World War II as an American ally, nationalist China under Chiang Kai-shek. It all went terribly, terribly wrong very soon after the end of World War II. And in that sense, I think if you stop the clock in, say, 1951 or 52, victory is extremely hard to find, because it turns out that both in Europe and in Asia, communists have been the real victors.
Sandy Hook, Connecticut, hello.
Hi. You described yourself earlier as a form of liberal. I don't remember the precise qualifier you used.
I'm a liberal fundamentalist, which sounds a little bit like a contradiction in terms, but it just means that I base my political outlook firmly on the teachings of the great 19th century liberals, John Stuart Mill. Perhaps I go a little bit further back to Adam Smith.
How about Locke?
Well, I think I'm probably more of an economic fundamentalist than a political fundamentalist, but yes, I probably plead guilty to be a Lockean.
Okay, so I've got a two-part question. Actually, I have a little tidbit that I'll let you figure out whether or not it relates, that'll add to it. The first one is, where would you locate yourself relative to the pragmatic tradition, specifically the modern pragmatic tradition in America? How would you find yourself in a conversation with the likes of Rorty? And then the other, and I think this is related, I'm well out of my depth talking with you, but it seems to me that what you're really doing is you're beginning to treat history with either as a form of literature or utilizing forms of, or what could be described as tools of literary criticism, and I would consider that to be really quite valid, and I agreed with the other interviewer that called in earlier and invited you on this program. And then the last one is, how would Goldner's work relate with yours, if at all? How do you view his point of view on political history?
One of the joys about being middle-aged is that you no longer have to bluff when you simply don't know something or haven't read something. I have not read Goldner's work, and I think in any conversation with Richard Rorty, I would be the most laughable amateur. I certainly don't make any great claims to being a political or legal theorist, and certainly not to being a political philosopher. That's not what I do. It's not my core competence, and I don't have any pretensions in that area. I think where I do have pretensions is, I suppose, in the realm of the philosophy of history, the theory of history, and your point about the literary dimension to what I do is an important one. After all, part of what historians traditionally have done is to construct big narratives, sometimes explicitly, like Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, sometimes more implicitly. And Hayden White, whose work I'm sure you know, has made it clear that these meta-narratives are an extremely important part of the Western historiographical tradition. Whereas I think my approach, with its emphasis on counterfactuals and contingencies, its rather more analytical approach, it's concerned to disrupt narratives, indeed to portray them all as in some measure teleologies leading to some deterministic outcome. I think that's really quite an innovative approach with implications for the way that history is written that haven't been fully grasped by many people who call themselves postmodernists, but don't in practice really grapple with the fundamental, if you like, anti-narrative tendency of much of what I do.
Denton, Maryland, hello.
Professor Ferguson?
Caller, I'm sorry, you need to turn your television set down, please.
Yes, just a minute.
Thank you.
Hello, this is Ed Scheibler in Denton, Maryland calling. I've read several of your books, Professor Ferguson, including The Pity of War, which I found extremely interesting on the origins and course of the First World War. Here is my question. At the very beginning of that time, in June of 1914, when the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated at Sarajevo, in the few days after that, the chief of the Austrian General Staff, I believe Konrad von Hötzendorf, and the Austrian foreign minister fed the aging Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria a good deal of misinformation about what the Serbian army was doing on the border of Bosnia-Herzegovina against the Austrian troops. And my question is, again, looking now at the concept of virtual history perhaps too, if Franz Joseph, who was then 84 and essentially senile, had been, say, 10 years younger, do you think he would have done something different and immediately authorized the ultimatum to Serbia, possibly accepting Sir Edward Grey's suggestion for another conference similar to the London Conference of 1912 to deal with the crisis?
Well, of course, it's conceivable that Austrian policy could have been different. It's certainly easy to imagine it's being more rational. Conrad himself behaved in an extraordinarily irrational way, as if oblivious to the military threat posed to his position by a two-front war. And when you look at the evolution of Austro-Hungarian strategy in the summer of 1914, it really is like something out of The Good Soldier Schweik, because there's a sort of frantic improvisation. They can't tell which direction they should march in. They start marching towards Serbia, then they have to about turn because they find themselves engaged in a war with the Russians. It's an extraordinary, almost absurd sequence of events. The trouble is that I don't think even 10 years younger, even 20 years younger, Franz Josef was really in a position to impose his authority on the decision-making process any longer. Remember how the monarchy had evolved institutionally since the Ausgleich of 1867. It was a monarchy in which the Hungarians now wielded disproportionate political power. It was supposedly a dual monarchy, but if you look closely at the duality, in many ways the Austrians were in a better position than the Hungarians were in a better position than the Austrians. And the decision-making process really reflected that institutional chaos. Karl Kraus, the great Viennese satirist whose work on the First World War has hugely influenced me, had described Austro-Hungary as an Aristo-Pluto-democratische mishmash of different political systems, which was incapable, in his view, of taking any rational strategic decision. In any case, it didn't terribly matter after a certain point what they did in Vienna, because both in St. Petersburg and Berlin, the decision for war had been taken. So in that sense, I think power quite quickly bled away from Budapest and Vienna to the German and Russian capitals.
Jeff Hope asked the question, getting back to empire. Can you please cite an empire that was able to stop an insurgency and keep the populace obedient?
Well, I mean, it's, of course, quite easy to cite numerous examples of successful counterinsurgency by the British Empire, going all the way back to its earliest days when it was constantly confronted with native rebellions, right the way through to the late stages of British imperial power, when the British won a guerrilla war in Malaya, very like the war that the United States lost in Vietnam. So it seems to me that one of the most important things Americans can take from British imperial history is at least some comfort that not all nationalist insurgencies are doomed to succeed. The key argument in my book Empire is in fact that the British Empire falls apart for other reasons. It's not nationalist rebellions that bring the British Empire down. It's actually the challenge posed by other empires. Those are the things that bankrupt the British, not Irish nationalists, not Bengali nationalists, not African nationalists, and certainly not the kind of people they came up against in Iraq in 1920, who were defeated. And after all, British military bases from 1917 to 1955, it's not long by the standards of the British Empire, but by the standards of the American Empire. That's a result.
You're watching In Depth with Niall Ferguson, our guest this month. Next call is Fresno, California. Hello.
Hello, yes. I'm sorry to say I haven't read your books on the Rothschilds. I was wondering if you could give a comment on David Icke's book, The Biggest Secret, in which he alleges that the Rothschild family is not of a Jewish background and that they changed their name from Bauer and are still very involved in world power and politics and the Bilderberg Group. Thank you.
Well, unfortunately, David Icke is mad, at least as far as I can infer from his published work. And I've dismissed his theories in the introduction to the history of the Rothschild Bank, which has a large section on myth and reality. In a way, David Icke is part of a very long tradition of myth-making about the Rothschilds, in which allegations fly around of all sorts of different sinister associations between the family. And it turns out in the mind of someone like Icke that they're involved with everything from the creation of the Federal Reserve System to the attack on Pearl Harbor to heaven knows what else. None of this is based on any serious historical evidence. In fact, it's conspicuous by its absence in his work. It's just a series of repetitions of conspiracy theories about the Rothschilds that go right back to the early 19th century. People have been making these claims, sometimes explicitly anti-Semitic, sometimes implicitly anti-Semitic, for very nearly 2 centuries. And I think we have to look very, very hard at them before we take them seriously. And what we have to look at is, where's the evidence? My book is based on historical research. It's based on archival records. And books like David Icke's simply are based on fantasy.
Where did you do your research?
All over the place.
For the Rothschilds?
Yeah, the Rothschild archives were quite widely dispersed. There's a huge holding of material in London. There's a very big holding in Paris. And some ended up by a very circuitous route in Moscow. Because the archive of the Austrian Rothschild house, there were 5 originally, branches of the bank in Europe. London, Paris, Frankfurt, the original one, Vienna and Naples. Now, the records of the Vienna house fell into the hands of the Nazis in 1938 in the Anschluss, and this goes back to some of our earlier callers. And they were taken away, impounded by the Nazis, and put into SS boxes for research on the terrible Jewish plot to achieve world domination, which the Nazis believed existed. At the end of the war, the Soviets turned up and found all these boxes marked SS and said, this looks highly suspect. We'd better take this back to Moscow for use in future war crimes prosecutions. I don't think they even opened the boxes. It all went back to Moscow. It all went into the secret archive of the KGB, the Osoba Archiv, and was forgotten about. Nobody even knew of its existence until about, I think, 91 or thereabouts, when it suddenly turned out that all this stuff was there, and that a whole range of organizations that the Nazis had persecuted had their stuff confiscated by the SS and then confiscated by the Red Army and sent to Moscow. So I ended up spending a fascinating time in Moscow in the early 90s, plowing through the Austrian records that had ended up there.
Did the Rothschild family cooperate with you?
They did, and indeed, in many ways, it was originally the idea of members of the family, that it was time a serious history was done, since there were so many bad ones out there, including the completely nutty conspiracy theories we were just talking about.
Nashville, Tennessee, hello.
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 Good afternoon, Dr. Ferguson, or Professor Ferguson. I've been reading about the British Empire for almost 50 years. Most recent among my reads is your wonderful book, Empire.
Thank you.
In the 1940s, when I began, Lord Rosebery's maxim, which I'll attempt to paraphrase, was very much still in play. The British Empire is the greatest secular force for good in human history. In the 1950s, the empire began to fall apart, and the argument coming out of Oxbridge at that time was it a good thing or a bad thing that the British Empire was coming apart? In the 1960s, opinions seemed to go totally in the direction of the British Empire was a very bad thing indeed. In the 1970s, Jan Morris came out with the Pax Britannica, Simon Winchester in the early 80s with The Sun Never Sets, saying that while there were certain bad things that were a result of the British Empire, it wasn't all bad. Now we come to you, and in many ways we seem to have returned to Lord Rosebery, and I'd like your comment on the further elucidation on the imposition of contemporary moral standards on history. Thank you very much. I'm really enjoying this.
Well, thanks very much for your kind words. And I should say that the Rosebery quotation is one of a number that I had in mind when I said that the book was not designed to be an unconditional whitewash or apologia for the empire, that the book was a warts and all, intended to be a warts and all portrait of the British Empire. In fact, in many ways, the book's a kind of cost-benefit analysis, rather in the spirit of was it a good thing, was it a bad thing, what's the balance sheet? And I think in that sense, I give as much space as is due to the downside, if you want to put it crudely, to the negative aspects of British imperial history, particularly in the 18th century, when essentially the empire is based on slavery and expropriation of indigenous peoples. I mean, nobody, of course, would want to sit down today and say that this was a good thing. But you raised the critical question, how far should we judge the past in terms of the present? Is it actually legitimate for us to sit here and pass judgment on 18th century imperialists for whom the institution of slavery seemed perfectly compatible with their Christianity? My answer to that would be that in many ways it was the British themselves, beginning in the late 18th century and going into the 19th century, who passed judgment on the institution of slavery. And in many ways what's, I think, at the heart of my book is a story of a radical alteration in moral categories. The British themselves criticized the empire of the 18th century and decided that in terms of labour and trade, it had not been free at all. And what they needed to have was a liberal empire, an empire based on not just on free trade, but on free labour, and therefore an empire that could not tolerate the institution of slavery. So rather than passing judgment in what might be anachronistic terms, what I try to do is to show how contemporaries judged the empire in their own terms, and how an individual like John Newton, who had been a slave trader as a young man, ultimately became one of the leading proponents of the abolition of slavery, partly as a result of his own religious conversion.
Lakeside, California.
Yes, hello, Mr. Ferguson. I've been watching you lately ever since about the last year or so, and you're a top-notch character from Britain. Unfortunately, a lot of the economic historians in this country have been, they're sort of heel hounds of the Wall Street Washington crowd, so I'm glad to see a free-spirited individual kind of telling us the truth about the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. My basic question is I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I'm just a guy who's trying to figure out what happened in the 20th century. And I came across a document that may not be for real, which is why I'm asking you your opinion. And it was basically a document that supposedly came out of the Nuremberg trials, where there was a signature on the paper. It had the same paper. It had Stadt, of course, which was responsible for helping to finance the Third Reich. It had Adolf Hitler's signature, of course, but it also had Max Warburg's signature on there. Now, that may be a fraudulent document, and that's kind of what I'm asking you. But in relationship to this, I think it was the head of the Reichsbank for the Third Reich mentioned something like, without the Swiss banks, I think his name was Fuchs, without the Swiss banks, we wouldn't have lasted more than 2 months. Now, that might have been just an off-the-mark comment. Again, I don't know, and that's why I'm asking you to help me out here. So, essentially, the UBS and Credit Suisse got fined a few years back by the EU for not being nice to some of the survivors of the Holocaust. And Credit Suisse, First Boston, and UBS in this country helped contribute to starting the recession through their fraudulent research. So, what do you got to say about any of that? And the last quick question, do you think the British will give up the pound for the euro? I really hope they don't, but we'll see what happens in the future, I suppose.
Well, let me take them briefly in the order you asked them, and of course some of the questions that you raise are impossible for me to answer. The first one particularly because no historian can comment on a document until he's seen it. And even then, he probably should take his time. So I would only say that it's quite unlikely that any document would bear both the signature of Hitler and of Max Warburg, who was a very eminent banker in the 1920s and 1930s, who stayed in Germany until 1938, trying very, very hard to preserve the rights of the Jews within the Third Reich, trying much too long to do that in the view of some of his relations who saw more clearly where Germany was headed. You wouldn't be surprised to find Warburg and Schacht in touch, but I would be very surprised to find anything, any document that brought the signatures of Hitler and Warburg together. It's almost inconceivable, not least because Hitler was not a great man for signing documents. It wasn't really one of his styles of authority. Second question that you raise about the Swiss banks is a very important one. I don't think anybody today in Switzerland would deny that Swiss financial institutions were complicit in the crimes of the Third Reich and benefited from, to take just one example, the lapsing of insurance policies of Jews who fell victim to the Holocaust. And investigations, very serious investigations, have been going on now for some years into the role of different Swiss institutions. And I think a rather healthy and belated revelation of their involvement is currently underway. As to the current role of Swiss banks in the economic world, I think it would probably be imprudent of me to comment. We read in our newspapers of the current criminal investigation of a former investment banker at Credit Suisse First Boston. I think in common with many of the world's financial institutions, Credit Suisse took its eye off the ball as far as corporate governance and due good conduct were concerned during the late 1990s bubble, and the individuals concerned are clearly facing the consequences today. I think the institutions themselves are engaged in the kind of clearing out of the stables that was clearly in order.
Will England take the euro?
That's the first question I've forgotten to answer so far. Number 3, I do apologise.
You did very well.
I was struggling to think of what number 3 was there. No, it's not going to happen. I think it's very clear, and it's been clear for some time, that Gordon Brown, who may very well be Tony Blair's successor as Prime Minister, sees no obvious benefit to the United Kingdom from joining the Eurozone and some very serious risks. And I think credit where credit's due, it was Brown's decision to give independence to the Bank of England that created a coherent alternative to euro membership. We now have a better monetary policy in Britain than they have in Germany because the Bank of England is doing a better job than the European Central Bank. And I think as long as that continues, euro membership is simply off the agenda in Britain.
Chicago, hello.
Professor, good morning.
Good morning.
My question is in the spirit of the what-if approach to history. If the United States, in your view, had intervened in Iraq on a purely humanitarian basis, in other words, to exploit democratic government, to eliminate the regime, as opposed to the threat articulated by the administration in terms of global security and weapons of mass destruction and so forth. Number one, do you think that that policy would have enjoyed more support among the American people, among the world community, given post 9/11 sentiment? And number two, do you think the policy in the post-war period that we're in now would have enjoyed some more support because of a perceived sense of legitimacy and not a sort of pretext for intervention, as I think is common, at least in my opinion, wrongly in the Arab world?
Well, I think yes and yes are the answers to questions 1 and 2. I think that at the time I felt uneasy about the emphasis that was being placed not only by President Bush and Colin Powell, but also by Tony Blair on weapons of mass destruction. And I felt that there were better reasons, and had been, of course, for many years, better reasons for a reckoning with Saddam Hussein. I should say right away that I advocated the overthrow of Saddam Hussein well before September the 11th, 2001, because he's an egregious tyrant who's committed horrific violations of human rights, as well as posing a threat to the stability of the Middle East. The problem, I think, and you've put your finger on it, is that on close inspection, the evidence that he had weapons of mass destruction that posed a threat to certainly the United Kingdom was non-existent. And secondly, that in many ways that has made it much harder to justify what's currently being done in Iraq. The legitimacy of any intervention is crucial for it to succeed. Unilateralism is not really an option for any great empire. As the great Lord Salisbury understood, there's nothing worse for an empire than splendid isolation. But you need to pursue your objectives with legitimate arguments to justify intervention against a country like Iraq. You need to have something more than rather flaky intelligence. I think the most that can be said in defense of Bush and Blair at this point is that at the time the decision was taken, Saddam Hussein had consistently failed to cooperate, had failed to be straight with the UN weapons inspectors, with two regimes of weapons inspection. So there was no certainty that he had no WMD. We could not be sure. I think a lot of people have forgotten that now and act as if we already knew what we now know. But I think even allowing for that, a better case could have been made that would have stood up to closer scrutiny. And I think if, as you say, a better case had been made then the collapse of public opinion we're currently witnessing at home and abroad might not be happening.
You said you supported the overthrow of Saddam Hussein before 9/11 within the country, or were you supporting other countries going in?
Well, in the final chapter of the Cash Nexus, which was written in 2000, I argued explicitly that the United States should use its capability to deal with rogue regimes and tyrants like Saddam. I also mentioned Slobodan Milosevic and I think Colonel Gaddafi in the same breath. So I can't really argue that I wasn't advocating this policy. I was, and I stand by that. I think it's an extremely good thing that Saddam Hussein is no longer in power in Iraq. But I'm concerned that the operation could unwind all too rapidly, precisely because of the point that our last caller just made. The legitimacy of this war is now in very serious doubt in the minds of at least half of the American electorate, maybe more. That has to be bad news for nation building as a policy.
Out to the West Coast, West Hollywood. Hello.
Hello, good morning. I'm really quite interested, having worked with the Palestinians for the last 40 years, that you see history so completely different than many of us who were working in the peace movement with the Palestinians. One comment you said earlier is that Bush kind of modeled his occupation of Iraq with the occupation of Germany. The reality is he's modeled his occupation of Iraq with the occupation of the Palestinians. And it's very, very similar. You talk about tyrants in the Middle East and fail to mention that Sharon is busy committing genocide against the Palestinians. So my question to you is, looking back almost 100 years now, since Britain, as far as many of us are concerned, is largely responsible for the mess in the Middle East and largely responsible for the rise of militant Islam, in part because of the Balfour Declaration, when your country divided a country that was already occupied by the Palestinians. Two quick questions. In retrospect, was the Balfour Declaration a wrong thing to do? And number two, why on earth should the Palestinians have to pay the price for what Europe did to the Jews in World War II?
Thank you, caller.
Well, just 2 points that I'd make in response to that. I think it's quite incorrect to claim that policies of genocide are currently being conducted by Israel against the Palestinians, and I think anybody who looks at the correct definition of the term genocide would see that at once, though I certainly don't condone the kind of tactics that are being used by the Sharon government against the Palestinians. I do certainly recognize the threat that's posed to Israeli citizens, the citizens of a democracy, by suicide bombers from terrorist organizations explicitly committed to the destruction of the State of Israel. So I think that's point number one. Point number two is, so many people talk about the problems of the Middle East as if the British invented them, conjured them up out of nowhere. And this is so historically ill-informed that it slightly upsets me. Prior to Britain's involvement specifically in Palestine and more generally in the Middle East, there was another empire that operated in that region. That was the Ottoman Empire, run by the Turks. Now, nobody could claim for a second that this was a wonderful and irenic institution, since it did commit genocide against the Armenians in the course of the First World War, and that was a real genocide, something which I'm glad to say that justified the destruction of the Turkish Empire. And in a sense, one has to recognize Britain's involvement in the Middle East as a significant improvement on the state of affairs prior to that time. And an improvement not only for Christian minorities, but for all religious minorities, including, of course, the Jews, who had not, as it were, simply popped up in Palestine out of nowhere in 1917-18, but had a long and historic link to the Holy Land. The Holy Land throughout the 19th century had been the scene of long diplomatic wrangles between the great powers, precisely on the issue of the rights of the different religions that inhabit that region. It was not a problem the British invented. It was a problem that predated their involvement in the region by many, many, many centuries. As to the question of whether the Balfour Declaration was a good or a bad thing, one has to remember the context within which the Balfour Declaration was made. There was a very, very desperate struggle in Europe between Britain and her allies and Germany and her allies. One rationale for the Balfour Declaration was to rally the opinion of Jews around the world before the Germans made a similar declaration of their own, which it was well known to British intelligence they were planning to do. Remember, Germany in World War I, in fact, pursued a policy of Jewish emancipation because as it invaded Russian territory, it was greeted as a liberator by the Jews who'd been subject to pogroms in Russia. Now, I've answered at great length because I think these are very complex, very sensitive issues, and I become upset when I hear simplifications of the sort that say there was no problem in the Middle East until the wicked British turned up and created one. I'm afraid that's simply a misrepresentation of the past. And it also underestimates the struggle that the British Empire undertook to try to keep the different conflicting ethnic and religious groups from one another's throats right up until the breakdown of British authority in the region.
Springfield, Virginia.
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Yes, I have a very simple question. Do you know Oriana Fallaci, the Italian writer? And if you do know, have you read her last two books? They have to do with Islam and the way Islam is permeating all the West.
This reminds me of one of those terrible Oxford tutorials when the tutor asks the student whether he or she has read the books on the reading list, and the answer comes back, well, actually, no, I couldn't find it in the library, or no, I was rather busy. I'm afraid I haven't read that author's work, and I suppose that's just another sign of the terrible truth that I'm not omniscient. But as I always say to students, you know, I don't pretend to have read everything or to know everything. I don't mind telling you that I haven't read those books. Should I read them? Tell me what they say.
Who do you read?
Well,
these days,
I'm at the moment reading Sebastian Haffner's extraordinary memoir of his struggle against Nazism. I've been reading a couple of extremely interesting books on American foreign policy and strategy. A book by Walter Russell Mead and John Lewis Gaddis' new book on 9/11 and its historical legacy. So my bedside table is a bit of a battlefield. I've just finished a wonderful book, which I strongly recommend to you, which is the war diary of Viscount Alanbrooke, who was the chief of the Imperial General Staff and the most important British military officer during World War II. And Alanbrooke's diary is just fantastic because it reveals what might be called the shadow side of Winston Churchill as a war leader. For Alan Brooke, Churchill was a maverick who was constantly going off in the wrong strategic direction. Whereas, and this is why I enjoyed the book so much, Alan Brooke saw very clearly some of the perils of Churchill's leadership. So, you know, there are many things on my bedside table vying for my attention.
Is that published in the United States, or do you get a lot of books that are...
I think it probably is, but I'm
Is
prepared
it?
to be told that it's not. It should be. It certainly should be, because one of the fascinating things about it is the way that Alan Brooke criticizes Eisenhower and the Americans. In fact, the whole thing is one long complaint about the way the Americans want to fight the war.
As you were talking about the books that you're reading, we were showing our viewers what some of your favorite nonfiction books over time have been, including the A.J.B. Taylor book, Struggle for Mastery in Europe, Robert Blake Disraeli's, The Golden Iron by Fritz Stern, Lothar Gall's Bismarck, and Robert Skidelsky's book on Keynes.
Well, you asked me prior to the program to name some of the best history books I've read, and I had about 2.5 minutes before I had to sprint out the door to give a class, so I jotted those ones down in an email. And indeed, that is a very wonderful array of books. I think anybody who's seriously interested in modern European history particularly would really be remiss if he or she hadn't read at least some of them. Taylor's Struggle for Mastery is an extraordinary work of scholarship. It's one of the most scholarly books that Taylor wrote, but also of literary exposition. In many ways, it's a model of how to transform the complexity of political history into something that is intelligible, without ever doing a violence to the subtleties and sophistications of events and the motivations of actors, which is something that Taylor's very good at. And I was an admirer of Taylor as a schoolboy. Indeed, it was one of the reasons I applied to Magdalen College, Oxford, that he had been a fellow there. Rather sadly, he wasn't a fellow by the time I turned up. I think he'd offended too many people. But I arrived at sort of devotee. But I hadn't at that point read The Struggle for Mastery. I'd read some of the more popular books, particularly his First World War book. And when I sat down and read The Struggle for Mastery, I felt myself in the presence of real historical greatness, because Taylor could write. He wrote like a dream. But also the mastery of the material. He's really the master of the title. The mastery of this incredibly complex diplomatic correspondence of the 19th century is just stunning, and takes you right the way from the 1848 revolution to the era of the First World War. It's a masterwork, and very, very few historians today could match that.
Atlanta, hello.
Hello. Good morning, C-SPAN.
Hello.
Good morning, Mr. Ferguson.
Hello.
My question is, do you think we should believe all the propaganda coming out of Iraq by the Western media because such blanket censorship? I would just want to hear your take on that.
Well, historians learn, and have learned over the generations, to be very careful about what is said by news media during wars. The first casualty of war is truth. It's an old adage, and it's as true today as it ever was. That's why we should all watch what we see on the television with skepticism. But we should watch not only, as it were, the output of American news organizations with skepticism. We should always also watch the output of Arab and European news organizations with skepticism, because there really is as much propaganda being broadcast by Al Jazeera and often relayed by European broadcasters as there is on, well, I shan't name any stations or broadcasters in this country, but I leave that to your imagination. That is the nature of war. It would be extraordinary if it were otherwise. The stakes are high, and there is something, I think, to be said for limiting the flow of information from any theatre of conflict. Indeed, it seems to me, from my rather British perspective, that the Bush administration's difficulties today are partly due to the amazing openness of American government. Compared with the government of any previous empire, you find out an awful lot more about how decisions are being taken. A book like Bob Woodward's new book about the planning of the war in Iraq, for that book to come out in the middle of the conflict, from the vantage point of a historian, is simply staggering. I mean, it really is as if somebody had been able to publish in, say, 1942, a book like Alan Brooke's diary that I was just discussing, a book which completely candidly reveals the decision-making process going on in the heart of government. In that sense, I think we're in a sense quite a long way away from the high secrecy era. The high secrecy era of, say, the First World War, when what was published in the newspapers bore virtually no relation to what was really happening. We've come a long way since then, and the very many news media that now exist that didn't exist 100 years ago give us choice. It's not as if there's just one television broadcaster giving you the American version of events. If you're skeptical about what Fox News are telling you, you can go to the BBC's website. You can even go to Al Jazeera's website. And in that sense, we live in a much more open world than the world of the past.
Have you spent any time in that part of the world, in Iraq?
I've never been in Iraq. I actually was on the Kuwait-Iraq border just before Christmas and would have gone further but for the fact that the insurance premium for a film crew are dauntingly high. I was filming a documentary that goes with the book Colossus. Like Empire, these books have a television alter ego which has been broadcast in the United Kingdom and I hope will be broadcast in this country. So we were filming all over what we were calling the American Empire and got up to that Kuwait-Iraq border. We also filmed in Lebanon because I'm a historian, I'm not a war correspondent. I actually felt a responsibility not to get in the way of the film crews that are covering the news while we were simply concerned with the history of America's relationship with the Middle East.
Augusta, Georgia, hello.
Yes, good afternoon, Professor Ferguson.
Hello.
I have two comments, and actually I would like for you to address these if you could, please. I think David Fromkin's book, A Peace to End All Peace, is a very in-depth look at the role the British government played in the pre-World War I era. And while the Ottoman Empire was not the best or most favorable empire towards the Arabs, I think the British Empire's role was more in the advancement of an economic situation in the Middle East. The second thing, and by the way, and that would also perhaps might refute some of your claims that the British Empire was more favorable with respect to the economy and the people in the Middle East. The second point I wanted to make was that I was wondering if you've read Joseph Kessler's book, The 13th Empire, which details the origin, so to speak, of the what we call the European Jewry now as we see it, and that might also refute some of the claims that the European Jews have with respect to Palestine.
Well, no, it's another book I haven't read. Terrible how my ignorance is being exposed today, but let me answer your first point. I think the key point that you made there is that there was an economic dimension to Britain's presence in the Middle East. Empires almost always have some kind of economic motivation, otherwise what's the point? And I think one of the important things to grasp about the British involvement in the Middle East, which really I think can be traced back to the occupation of Egypt in the 1880s, was that it was intended to have a developmental component to it. That's to say, as Egypt tottered on the brink of default in the late 19th century, the British went in and said, look, your institutions really aren't working. What you need is to have a modern system of tax collection, a modern system of debt finance. You need to stabilize your expenditures, and only by doing that will you be able to bring the tax burden on the Egyptian peasant down. And Cromer, who was the man put in charge of Egypt, at least informally, notionally, of course, Egypt was still a sovereign entity, but informally it was run by a British agent. And Lord Cromer's performance in that role was very impressive because Egyptian finances were stabilized and the Egyptian peasants' tax burden was roughly halved under Cromer's period in office. Of course, in Iraq, the story was slightly different. That all happened a little later. It happened at the end of World War I, as we've been discussing earlier. It happened as well before the discovery of oil. I think it's quite important to bear in mind that the British were in Baghdad in 1917. Oil wasn't discovered in the territory of Iraq until roughly 10 years later. So I think one has to be very careful about inferring economic motives with respect to oil. because British involvement in Iraq predated the discovery of oil there. But of course there was an economic project at work. The aim was to try and improve the economic performance of these countries and make them better trading partners for the United Kingdom. And I think if you compare the performance of Iraq under British influence, let's use that loose term, from the 20s through to the late 1950s, and compare its performance under the tyranny of Saddam Hussein, it's pretty clear which regime has been better for ordinary Iraqis, because Saddam's regime has been an unmitigated disaster.
We're going to take a short break, give you a little bit more background about our guest, Niall Ferguson, and also go back to the earlier point that you were talking, that you had pre-9/11 talked about the whole issue of military intervention. This was a portion of a speech that you gave to the Council on Foreign Relations in April of 2001, and you talked about the fact that even though America had a monetary grasp and control over a lot of things, that it had to get involved militarily. We'll show our viewers that, and we'll be back in just a moment.
Understretch, in other words, is the danger that great powers face, not overstretch. And I try to show in the book that it's a myth that excessive military expenditure has ever posed a threat to the United States economy. Far more serious is the risk that the British ran, that in complacently assuming that you dominate the globe, you underestimate the dangers that are developing not so far from your own back door. And this brings me to my concluding reflection. It's a reflection which has a moral as well as a pragmatic financial tinge to it. The question that I found myself asking as I completed the Cash Nexus, as I contemplated the enormous material wealth of American society, of Americans as individuals, was simply this. Americans clearly have the cash. They have the resources. But do they have the will? In fact, in the book I wrote the guts, to make the world a better place. By analogy, in the way that the British Empire sought, however unsuccessfully, to export British institutions, even to those godforsaken parts of Africa that we all know on the map, but never visit, even by analogy with that. Carlyle got it right. Cash, he wrote later, has not all power. And those Americans who imagine that here on planet Nasdaq, they are, for the future, sine die, a global superpower without rival, may be in danger of succumbing to that great delusion that ultimately sunk British power. Thank you very much for your attention.
For 15 years, best-selling nonfiction authors discussed their books on Booknotes. Now, nearly 80 of those authors are featured in the new book, Booknotes on American Character. Read these authors' unique insights into our national character. leadership and sacrifice, corruption and greed, ingenuity and activism. It's a great gift for those who love history and politics, and a must-have for book notes enthusiasts. Get a copy of Book Notes on American Character now at your local bookstore.
Thanks, everybody.
Maybe real quick.
We're back with Niall Ferguson, who is our guest on In Depth this month. Alan Moon of Dallas, Texas asks, have you written about Napoleon, and do you intend to?
Well, not a lot. I mean, Napoleon, of course, plays an important role in the early phase of the Rothschild history, because it was his defeat at Waterloo that posed one of the biggest challenges the family faced in its early years. So he's there in rather in the way that he is in War and Peace, as a sort of minor character, which is not quite what Napoleon fans expect. I have looming a large review article to write for the New York Review of Books on recent Napoleon literature. It's rather daunting me because there are now about 10 or 12 books on my shelf. And so there is going to be a kind of reckoning with Bonaparte at some point this year. Probably a summer job for me to undertake.
Have you, or are you currently in negotiations for writing a book on Kissinger?
It is something that I have been discussing for some time with Henry Kissinger and with others interested in this possibility. And the more I have thought about this as a next step, the more attracted I've been to the idea. I have quite pressing publishing commitments over at least the next 2 years. But the more I have thought about it, the more it seems like the kind of challenge, the sort of archival challenge, and also the challenge in terms of the sheer controversy of the subject, that is on a par with, say, the Rothschild history. And for some time I've been asking myself, what can I do when I move to Harvard that is on the same scale as the Rothschild book? I need to get back to some real primary research. I really do want to focus on some proper documentary work again, which has not been true of books like Empire or Colossus, which are based on secondary reading. And gradually I've begun to realize that partly because I'm here, partly because I've become involved in a debate about American foreign policy, there is no subject more challenging, more daunting than the life and times of Henry Kissinger for a historian with my background. And the one advantage that I have, no, there are two advantages. One is that I'm not an American. And in that sense, I think I approached the subject with perhaps rather less of the preconceptions an American historian might have. But the other great advantage is that this is a story that starts not in America. It starts in Germany. It starts in the Germany that I began my career studying, with a young man growing up, a Jewish boy growing up under the shadow of Nazism. And in that sense, it begins to make more sense than at first seemed to me to be the case.
Tell me about your family.
Well, I am a migrant worker at the moment, in the sense that I work in the United States, but my wife and children are still based in Oxford, in England. So I zip back and forth a great deal to make sure that I see Susan, my wonderful wife, really the inspiration of all I do, and our children, two of whom you can see there, the boys Felix and Lachlan, which is a wonderful Scottish name.
Lachlan?
Lachlan, or Lachie for short.
Ah.
Freya, my beautiful daughter, who's the one in the middle of the chronological range, is the photographer in this case. So you sadly can't see her. And that's a pity because she's a lot prettier than I am. But in any event, they're the ones that I'm missing to be here with you today.
And how old
my
are
thoughts
they?
are with them. Felix is 10. Freya is 9, and Lachie has just turned 5. I will not reveal my wife's age, as that would not be gentlemanly, but she and I really have the enormous good fortune to have found our twin souls in one another, and it's difficult to be away as much as I am, but we are hoping that over time her career and my career will geographically converge again after this period of separation.
Your parents?
My parents also now live in England, but they brought me up in Scotland. My father, Campbell Ferguson, a wonderful doctor, recently retired. My mother, Molly, a physicist, as I think I mentioned earlier. You can see in this rather amusing picture myself with my father last Christmas. I don't know who's wearing the more absurd headgear, but I quite fancy swapping with my father's paper crown. You can see we've just had a Christmas lunch and we're staggering around the Oxfordshire countryside, supporting one another in the great tradition of Scotsmen after a good lunch.
What influence did he have on you?
A huge influence, a huge influence. My debt to my parents is incalculable, because they provided me with something that perhaps is in short supply these days in Western Europe, and that is a sense of the ethic of work and a sense of morality, fundamental orientation, which I think only your parents can hope to give you. They inspired me with a sense that scholarship was the highest calling, that academic success was the thing for which I should strive. And I'm one of those rather sad figures who continually goes through life trying to please his parents. Most people have a sort of rebellious phase. I think mine lasted about 3 weeks, and for most of my life I very happily tried to fulfill particularly my father's aspirations, which I think from the age of 2 included getting me to go to Oxford. And I don't think he thought much beyond that, but I've always had a sense that that's the path I was, in a sense, born to follow, and I owe them so much.
And grandparents?
Well, my grandparents inspired me in extraordinary ways too. I was lucky because most of my grandparents lived into a ripe old age, despite the fact that both my grandfathers had seen action in the world wars. You can see there my wonderful grandmother, May Hamilton, who is still going strong in her 80s, and that was in many ways the matriarch of the family, and still is, now that she's a great-grandmother, a key figure in all our lives. Her husband, who's now last dead, Tom, and my father's father, whom you can see there, John Ferguson, were huge influences on me as a boy in 2 quite different ways. My father's father, who's pictured there in Ecuador after the First World War, had served as a teenager on the Western Front in one of the Highland regiments, and I grew up acutely conscious of the sacrifice that he had made of his young years in terrible conditions on the Western Front. He'd been wounded in the chest, was really quite lucky not to be killed. I suspect that must have been in early 1918. His chest was always weak after the war, as much from I think wartime smoking and gas as from that wound. But I knew him as an old man, a wheezy old man, and in many ways I think a sense of what he had done in the war was with me from my very earliest days, and was one of the reasons I wrote The Pity of War, a book about the First World War. It was in a sense a debt to him that I was paying. My other grandfather, Tom Hamilton, was younger and served in World War II in India and Burma. And if I had to single out one relative with whom I have a great deal in common, just in terms of the genetic legacy,
this is him,
it's
right?
him.
Uh-huh.
Because he was the writer. He was a journalist. Left school as a teenager and immediately started work on one of the Glasgow evening newspapers. And all his life he wrote, and he wrote beautifully. He was just one of life's natural-born writers. He didn't want to be in India in the early 1940s. He was, like so many of his generation, catapulted across the world by the war, separated from his wife and children, so much more than I have ever had to be that it's almost hard to grasp the pain and emotional strain of that era that so many people in that generation, not only in Britain but in this country, all over the world, experienced. But he was the one who taught me to write. I mean, he told me, this is the thing you can do and this is the thing you should do. Encouraged me so that for Christmas presents I would write a book for him, and that would be the present. And he never did anything but encourage me. And probably some people would say that he therefore bears a terrible responsibility for how prolific I am, because I think he always made me feel that writing should be something that one did for pleasure, that we were privileged to be paid to do. And I owe him an incalculable amount, because I think without him I wouldn't have had that sense that writing could be a career, a way of life. I wanted to be a writer from the earliest years.
In reading things about you, people do question, how does he write so much? I mean, the size of your books are large. As you said, you're only 40 years old. You have all of this body of work already. How do you do your research and how do you write? The nuts and bolts, tell us about it.
Well, I always struggle with this question because I don't quite see the problem. You know, I can probably write about 2,000 words a day.
2,000 a day?
The writing's not the difficult bit, the research is the difficult bit. Once you know what, once you've worked your way through the material, once you've understood it, once you know what you want to say, it shouldn't take you long to write a book. The difficult thing is unquestionably the research and the thought that goes on. How do I go about doing my work? Well, I think I've already suggested that there are really two different kinds of book that I write. One is based on archival research. It's based on documents, primary sources. That's very laborious. Involves reading, in effect, the letters of the dead, the letters of people whom you perhaps have never met, in great quantities. I mean, the Rothschild book was based on tens of thousands of letters that I ploughed my way through. Other books, of which Empire, Colossus, and the Cash Nexus are good examples, are based really on taking the literature of others, taking large secondary literatures on, say, financial history or American foreign policy, and trying to synthesize them into something new, trying to make an argument that's novel. And in a way, that kind of book grows out of teaching. A lot of what I have done, a lot of the, I suppose, the fertility of my mind when it comes to ideas, has been due to the constant interaction with students that has gone on. And there's nothing quite as good as teaching for as it were, spawning ideas. Every tutorial in Oxford and Cambridge that I had, every class that I teach now at NYU, and I'm sure it will be true at Harvard too, has in a sense been the kernel of some new writing undertaking. Because at the end of the tutorial, at the end of the class, if you haven't clarified your thought, then you probably failed to teach well. So this constant process of clarification of thought means that there are ideas spinning off every day, and every now and then one has to sit down and try and translate them into something that others can share. I mean, Colossus was written very fast because in the space of less than 12 months, I had become so caught up with the debate on American policy post 9/11. I'd become so convinced that Americans were being, in a sense, directed the wrong way, learning from the wrong history, when there were these staringly obvious examples from the British experience. And so it's almost a polemical book. It's almost a book that says, look, you can think about American history not as a unique, exceptional story, but as the story of just another empire facing much the same sorts of problem that all empires face, and particularly the problems that the British Empire faced. I was fired up by this so much last year that it took just really a few months to write. I'd done a lot of reading, and I did have some wonderful research assistants to speed that process up. But in the end, when it came to writing it, the thing simply, it spilt, as it were, onto the keyboard and into my computer's hard disk.
Is this the book you got the $1.3 million advance for?
Well, it's a very strict rule of mine that I never talk about my finances, because I think there's certain things which do
Other
not
people have talked
belong
about
in public domain. Well, I know people love to speculate about these things, but everything that's ever been said on this subject is fictional, because I've never commented on it, and there's simply no basis for these statements.
Let's get back to the phone calls. Woodland, Texas, you're next with Niall Ferguson. Hello.
Yes, I read your book on Empire and thoroughly enjoyed it. And immediately went out and ordered the rest of all your books. Last writer I felt like that about was Barbara Tuchman. My question for you, in Martin Dick Millen's book, 1919, or The Peacemakers as you may know it, she mentioned that the British had discovered oil in Mosul, and that was one of the reasons why they went after Iraq. But my question is, based on maybe that book and also T.E. Lawrence's book, The Seven Pillars of Wisdom, what can the United States do, based on history and knowing things in history, to get this situation right in Iraq today? I know that's calling on you for an opinion, but it should be an educated opinion.
Well, Daniel Yergin's book, The Prize, which is really the best history of the oil industry, makes it clear that the British hoped that there would be oil in their new Middle Eastern empire, but it wasn't confirmed that there was oil in Iraq until the mid-20s. We know that they had this hope because they were doing their best to keep the guys from Standard Oil, from the United States, from prospecting in Iraq. So in that sense, one shouldn't rule out the importance of oil as a consideration, but it was a speculative consideration until, I think, 1927. Margaret Macmillan's book is, of course, an extremely interesting book, though, to be honest, it didn't tell me anything about the peace settlement of 1919 that I didn't already know. I think it's one of those works which does a very good job of popularizing current scholarship, and it does that admirably well. But I don't think Margaret Macmillan would claim to be in any sense an expert on either the oil industry or the Middle East. The question you ask about the situation today is, of course, the $87 billion question. And I come back to the theme on which I've harped earlier. The most important thing at this point is to recognize that it's early days. If you had gone, say, to West Germany in late 1946 or to Japan, if you'd gone anywhere really where the United States has intervened militarily and given, in a sense, the operation just 16 months or so to succeed, you wouldn't see much sign of success. These things take time. I actually don't think it's a foregone conclusion that this operation will end in tears. It's teetering on the brink at the moment. Many Americans are losing faith in the intervention. They already wish to see troops being withdrawn or the number of troops reduced. In fact, I was stunned to see in a poll the other day that nearly half of all Americans want troops out or the numbers to be reduced. If that were to happen, I shudder to think what the consequences would be, because the situation in Iraq is so unstable. Economic recovery hasn't really begun to incentivize young men to keep out of violence. It's much too early to be running down the American forces there. I am hoping against hope, that America's political leaders will, as it were, persuade the public to go the distance and convince people that it is, whatever you thought of the war, whatever your views were about the decision to topple Saddam Hussein, it is now vital that the United States does not cut and run. And so in a sense, I think everything here hinges on the timing and on the way in which American politicians persuade a skeptical electorate that it is really worth going the distance now to avoid very terrible dangers in the future.
New York City, hello.
Hi, yeah, thanks very much for taking my call. Sure. I suppose I'm a colleague of Mr. Ferguson's, at least for a week or two at this point at NYU. So I had a question actually about method and a couple other points about the Middle East, my area of interest. First, in terms of method, you mentioned that you're very interested in the views of contemporaries. But what strikes me is that in all of your discourse, the contemporaries you're interested in seem always to be only the Western sort of imperialists, British administrators, etc., and never really the perspectives of maybe colonialism's victims or subjects, or at least only in a superficial way. And so I wondered if you might comment about that. And the other issue is about the kind of legacy of the British Empire in the Middle East. Many people argue that in some ways British derailed growing democracy, modernization, and industrialization, particularly in Egypt. Perhaps you recall the Urabi Revolt of the 1870s, which was a move to restore parliamentary democracy and constitutional rights against British control. And I think you can see that legacy in other places as well.
Well, can I ask you, esteemed colleague, if you've read my book, Empire?
Sorry, he's already gone.
Of course, that's the key question here. If you did, and I'm sure you'll find time to do so if you haven't, you'll find that, in fact, the perspectives of the subjugated peoples, of the colonized peoples, are as much cited and as much in evidence in the book as the views of imperial administrators. In fact, one of the most important chapters, the fourth chapter on the way in which the British ruled India, stresses the fact that it was inconceivable that barely 900 British civil servants could run a subcontinent with a population of 300 or 400 million people. The reality of British India was that it was, in fact, the Indians who governed themselves through the non-covenanted civil service composed of Indians, and through a whole complex of other Indian elites who had a clear interest in the benefits of the British system of rule. The message of that chapter is that empire is based on consent and collaboration. It is not primarily based on coercion. And to understand how empires function, serious scholars have to look at the reasons why local elites were prepared to, as it were, sacrifice sovereignty in exchange for partnership with a British ruling elite. And that's really one of the key themes of the book. It's, of course, the question you've answered is the standard question that anybody asks who comes from the post-colonial studies side of the subject. And it's a question that's almost always asked before these interrogators have read the book. If you read it, you'll see that my interest is as much in the experience of Asians and Africans, or for that matter, Native Americans and Australians, as it is in colonial administrators.
Cleveland, hello.
Hi. Professor Ferguson, I'm really enjoying your conversation.
Thank you.
Earlier, you defined empire in two different ways, kind of a narrow, more malevolent, manipulative empire, and then a broader, more influence-wielding empire. Isn't that second definition unavoidable when you're a superpower? And isn't it not necessarily a bad thing? I mean, we are routinely criticized for not using our power as a fulcrum to affect change around the world. That's my first question. My second question was the notion, the myth of, the Jewish cabal pulling, the Jewish puppet masters controlling finance. Did that predate the Rothschilds, or did the Rothschild success give rise to that in the virulent anti-Semitism you saw in the last century in Europe?
Well, thanks for those two excellent questions. I think the first one I would concur with heartily. That little clip that was shown just before the break of a speech I made before 9/11, I think, was my contribution to the argument that American policy in the 1990s had been rather disastrously ineffectual, and that crises in the Balkans and, of course, in Central Africa had been rather woefully mishandled by an administration that took the view that a single American casualty was too high a price to pay for intervention in a civil war or against a rogue regime. And I was trying to argue in the Cash Nexus that really we needed to see the superpower behaving a little bit more systematically like an empire. I don't, by the way, think the empire word is one that needs to be used today. My policy would be to learn lessons from past empires and to understand some of the pitfalls of trying to impose American or other institutions in foreign soils. But I think there's a crucial point to be made here that it is much more likely to be a successful undertaking today if the United States can operate through the United Nations and in partnership with other great powers. I do think unilateralism is the pitfall here that the Bush administration has really fallen into. Your second question is a fascinating one. The myth of Jewish power, of a cabal of sinister and influential financiers, in some senses did predate the Rothschilds because, of course, anti-Semitic legends, the whole range of fantasies about the Jews that had been fostered since medieval times, the blood sacrifice myth, for example, that had a very long and ghastly history. And Jewish financiers, the so-called court Jews of the 17th and 18th century in Europe, had been vulnerable to accusations of excessive power. And I think the case of Sus Oppenheimer is the most obvious case of an 18th century Jewish financier who fell victim to the allegation that he was wielding a sinister power behind the scenes in Germany. But the Rothschilds changed the scale of the myth because for the first time, as a result, of course, of Jewish emancipation during the French Revolutionary Wars, it was possible for a Jewish family to do much more than simply become dependents of a German court. It was possible for them to create a financial multinational. It was possible for them to own property on a colossal scale. It was possible for them to do business throughout the world. And in that sense, contemporaries saw something new, and they knew it was new. And that's what Heinrich Heine makes very clear about the Rothschilds. This is a revolution, he says. Rothschild's as big a revolutionary as Robespierre because of the way he's transforming the nature of wealth and power. And for that reason, and it's one of the most important arguments in my book, the Rothschilds became a family with special significance in the minds of anti-Semites and conspiracy theorists of both left and right, because they just seemed to be an order of magnitude more powerful than any previous Jewish family.
Isla Murata, Florida.
Hello.
Hi.
Professor Ferguson, my question is, since you've stated that the real powers tend to be bankers and then politicians, etc., what comments would you have about the American backing of or creation of the Union Banking Corporation in Berlin in 1924 as a mode for backing the accession of Hitler to power, as well as the involvement of such names as Prescott Bush and the Harrimans.
Yes, I think these are classic examples of circumstantial evidence in a historical argument. The reality, as Henry Ashby Turner demonstrated in a brilliant book, Big Business and the Rise of Hitler, published many years ago now, is that the one group that really did not have a very obvious enthusiasm for the Nazi Party in 1920s Germany was in fact big business, and particularly the banks. It's quite hard to find anything other than the most flimsy evidence of a serious involvement of financial institutions with the financing of the Nazi Party. Very, very few bankers wanted to know. They thought Hitler was a dangerous radical and extremist. And of course it was difficult for the very obvious reason that there was no sector of the German economy with quite so many senior Jewish executives and proprietors as the financial sector. It was therefore very, very hard to imagine why banks based in Berlin would be in anything other than appalled at the prospect of a National Socialist government. What's true is that, of course, American banks were very energetically involved in investing in Germany in the 1920s, opening branches, trying as far as possible to do loans for German government and corporations. So it's not hard to find evidence that there were German American banks involved in the Weimar economy, but to find evidence that they had any serious role in the rise of Hitler, I think is a stretch.
Niall Ferguson's name was on Time magazine's recent list of 100 most influential. Is that? I think that was their
measure. I wish I did feel influential. I barely have any influence over my own children.
One of your British newspapers made a story about it because Tony Blair didn't make the list and you did.
Yes, that gave me huge pleasure. I have to confess, but it also, I think, sets in perspective the metric of influence here. I was hugely flattered and touched that I had this accolade conferred on me. I think only one other historian, Bernard Lewis, had made the cut. I guess you could count Samantha Power as an historian for her work on genocide. So maybe there were three of us in this field. But influence is a very hard thing to quantify, and I'm a historian who likes things to be quite carefully quantified. What, in fact, Time magazine's articles revealed was that we have a very nebulous notion of what power and influence are. When we try and specify who very powerful people are in the world, we don't, in fact, have a way of measuring it. And I certainly, if I were to draw up a list of the 100 most influential people in the world, would not have included Niall Ferguson. I don't think I'd have made my own personal list of the 100,000 most influential people in the world, because I don't happen to think that historians, whether their books are short or long, good or bad, have that much influence. Sadly, it would be nice if we had more influence, but my sense is that we don't really.
Bellevue, Washington. Hello.
Hello.
You're on the air, sir.
Hello.
Professor, I don't want to make this a marathon of what books have you read or anything, but there's a recent book I'm reading now, Sorrows of Empire by Chalmers Johnson.
Hooray! One I've read.
Oh, good. Well, and of course I shouldn't tell you what he wrote other than that he said that he says be aware of the military-industrial complex and the money that's spent on wars and then I just wanted to know your your opinion of Chalmers' book on empire.
Well, Chalmers Johnson has been contributing for some time now to quite a long tradition of radical left-of-centre scholarship in the United States that you can really trace back as far as the 60s, even further. And if you look at his last book, Blowback, the argument was broadly similar there, that the United States is an empire, behaves like an empire, and that this is a bad thing, and that it almost always has negative consequences, not only abroad, but domestically, as the power of the military grows relative to what might be called the institutions of the Republic. Now, that's very different from my position, as you will have realized, in the sense that I argue that the United States behaves like an empire, is functionally quite like an empire, but doesn't recognize that about itself, and therefore doesn't do as good a job as it might. In other words, I allow for the possibility that an American empire could be, and indeed should be, a good thing, should be on balance better than, say, American isolationism. Where I guess Chalmers Johnson would say that it's just in the nature of American imperialism that it's always bad. It was bad in Vietnam, and it's bad now in Iraq. It seems to me a fascinating time in American political debate, because more and more writers are using the E word as saying, this is an empire, get used to it. But I think the majority of writers are still essentially of the opinion that this is a bad thing and that America should have no truck with empire. I'm rather a sort of quirky minority in thinking that that if the United States does it right, it can be an even better empire, significantly better empire than the British Empire. And there are lots of things about the British Empire which could be improved upon. The British Empire, for example, was quite a racist empire in its ethos. It was based on a hierarchy of races. Well, there's absolutely no need to replicate that today. And in that sense, one of my real themes here is what can the United States learn about empire from the British experience, and how can it improve on that experience?
And is it true that in Colossus you say not only that America is an empire, but it's always been an empire?
Yes, and I think this is quite an important point that is not widely recognized, in at least in the wider public. I think there are some historians, Ernest May and Charles Mayer come to mind at Harvard, who have been arguing for some time that this is an essentially imperial undertaking. If you come to American history fresh, as I have, and I make no bones about this, I am not an expert in the history of the United States, come to it as a comparative historian of empire, what do you find? Well, you find that there are 13 colonies that secede from the British Empire in the 1770s. And what happens? They then expand with dramatic speed westwards across the American continent. So successfully that effectively, if you go back and look at the size of the 13 colonies, they account for what, maybe 8% of the territorial extent of the United States today. In 19th century terms, it's an imperial success story. The only one that expands that fast, apart from Britain, is actually the Russian Empire, which at about the same time goes into the Caucasus and across Siberia. So it's an empire, and what's more, the Founding Fathers intended it to be one. Hamilton, Madison, Washington, they all refer to the United States as an empire. It's a word that they regularly used, and it's only really quite recently, as we were saying earlier, particularly I think in the aftermath of Vietnam, that this E word has become wholly negative in its connotation, and the myth has risen up. The United States has never been an empire. We don't do empire. The things that President Bush says in his speeches, the things that Donald Rumsfeld says in his speeches. Well, there's that great Shakespeare line, methinks he doth protest too much. The more I hear Americans say, we're not an empire, we don't do empire, we're not in the empire business, the more I feel like saying, just read my book and tell me in what respect precisely the United States has not been an absolutely classic empire, expanding territorially, expanding culturally, expanding economically, and projecting its power globally.
Next call is New York City. Hello.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, first, I'm going to be a nitpicker. When we were speaking about the Balfour paper earlier, we were talking about a homeland for the Jews, and I believe it was very heavily negotiated that the area known as Palestine was to be a home, not a homeland. And the negotiation over that wording was very, very heavy. And going back to the American Empire thing, the Nile isn't just a river in Europe. Thank you. You're a very interesting man.
Well, I appreciate the, I don't think it's nitpicking. I think it's very important. And I hope that I had made it clear that what the Balfour Declaration does is essentially to create the possibility of a Jewish home within what was intended to be a British colony. It certainly was not a Zionist document. On the contrary, the Zionists were quite disappointed with it. So you're making a very important point here about the origins of modern Israel that sometimes I think gets lost in the highly politicized rhetoric of our own times.
Niall Ferguson's list of the great world leaders include Bismarck, Gladstone, Winston Churchill, Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher. Next call, Manassas, Virginia.
Yes, thanks for your comments about needing to understand the historical perspective. Do you believe that empires, including American empire, contemporary, enjoys a disproportionate empire beyond natural evolutionary influence? In other words, is our empire disproportionate scale beyond our economic resources?
I think conceivably, one of the key arguments that I make in this new book, Colossus, is that although the United States looks on paper like the biggest empire ever in terms of its firepower and in terms of its gross domestic product, its economic resources, there are three fundamental deficits that explain why it's quite unsuccessful as an empire. Its economic performance, if you like, is only part of the story. There's an economic deficit which most of us know about, which I've talked about already today, that sense that the United States, in fact, is dependent on foreign capital to maintain its current level of prosperity. But there are two other important deficits that we haven't really mentioned. One is the manpower deficit. The interesting thing about the United States as an empire, of course, is that it doesn't really have settlers leaving the United States in significant numbers to the periphery in the way that, of course, the United Kingdom did. On the contrary, the United States imports people. It's still the #1 destination for economic migrants in the world. And that makes it quite hard for the United States to exercise power in its periphery. It's really just soldiers and a relatively few civilian contractors in Iraq at the moment. No Americans want to go and live there. In fact, hardly any Americans do live in the Middle East, and most of those live in Israel. The very few Americans who are permanently resident abroad, and there are barely 4 million of them, are either in Canada, Mexico, or Western Europe. So there's a manpower deficit, which I think limits how powerful this empire can be. But you know, the biggest deficit of all is actually the attention deficit. The problem about this empire is it's the first empire in history to have attention deficit disorder syndrome. When it intervenes in a country, as we're seeing right before our very eyes, unless results are instantaneous, unless it's all over and done with within a 2-year time frame, the American empire gets tired, loses interest, becomes disillusioned. And that, in a sense, is the biggest of all the weaknesses of this empire.
Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. Hello, Valley Forge. It helps if I press the button. Hello.
If the author could, if he would consider commenting about good and evil in society. I've witnessed the vacillation. It seems like a zero-sum game. It's like as good goes up, evil goes down, and up and down, and it's scary because it has become personal to me. And I drop a name, M. Scott Peck, People to Lie. It's a book. He wrote it a long time ago, one of the best tomes, I believe. And if you would, sir, please.
Well, it's interesting that for many years historians rather shied away from using moral categories like good and evil and preferred, as far as possible, to portray historical events and structures objectively. It was fascinating to me as a young student in the 1980s to read histories of Nazi Germany written by some very eminent historians, I think here of the work of Hans Mommsen, that seemed to pass no judgment whatsoever, other than an implicitly negative one, on the moral character of National Socialism. Now, I think that's changed, and one of the historians who's changed it, and I think decisively, has been a British historian by the name of Michael Burley. Now, Burley's history of the Third Reich, a new history of the Third Reich, as he called it, is really a fantastic piece of work. It's brilliantly researched. He is a scholar of the first order. But he's also not afraid to point out the most important thing about Adolf Hitler was that he was an evil man, and his movement was profoundly evil. One of the interesting things about, of course, questions of good and evil is that they're almost impossible to separate from religious belief and the ethos of the world's religions. Judgments of a moral nature, say in the case of National Socialism, have, it seems to me, at least implicitly, some relationship to the ethics of the Old and New Testament. And this is something which is again problematic for historians, a great many of whom I think would probably be relatively secular in their religious outlook, and not particularly Christian in their orientation. For me, this is a very interesting and important problem, because I confess to being somebody who was not given a very orthodox religious upbringing. Both of my parents, and indeed other members of the family, were what would be called, or would have been called, free thinkers. I didn't regularly attend church, and I don't think I'll ever really have any classical religious faith. I think that's probably something that's beyond my reach. On the other hand, I'm very conscious that ethics, that the ability to distinguish between good and evil, these things are not naturally occurring in human beings. If they're not instilled by some systematic educational framework, And I think this is what the history of not only Nazi Germany, but Soviet Russia and Maoist China shows. If you remove religious order from society, just as Dostoevsky foresaw in the terrifying, Raskolnikov's terrifying vision in Crime and Punishment, then literally all hell can break loose. Evil can be unleashed. So my sense is rather like that of the great French political theorist Tocqueville, who was himself rather skeptical about religion. He nevertheless believed, and I believe too, that an element of religious education is an extremely important part of our social order. And I look with some alarm at the extent to which Western Europe has been largely de-Christianized in the past 2 decades. I wonder where young Europeans in fact get their ethical teaching. Where do they learn the difference between good and evil? I don't myself believe you can easily discern this if you're never at any point exposed to the Old and New Testament.
San Marcos, Texas.
Hi, Mr. Ferguson. It's a pleasure to talk to you. Hey, the last book I read of yours actually was The Pity of War. And I have a question. Have you gone over, having heard that you think that Thatcher and Reagan are your some of the best political leaders in the world, have you gone over any type of political conversion? A la Christopher Hitchens. I don't know if you're ever a Marxist, but have you personally gone over any type of political conversion farther to the right?
Well, it's a difficult question to answer that, but I don't think I could really claim to have had any political conversions in my mature years, but rather like Pierre in War and Peace. I experimented in my teens. I think when I was 15, I was quite a passionate Scottish nationalist for about 3 months. And I think when I was about 16 or 17, I may have even supported the Labour Party in a school general election. But I think I can say fairly certainly that from the moment I arrived in Oxford, aged 17 or 18, that my political orientation shifted fairly firmly towards that neoliberal movement that was clearly a crucial component of both Thatcherism in Britain and the Reagan era in the United States. For me, there were really only 2 issues in the 1980s that mattered. One was how to salvage capitalist economies, which had been so disastrously screwed up in the 1970s by a mixture of socialist and Keynesian policies. And the other was what to do about the Soviet Union, which still posed an obvious and grave menace to political freedom. So from really 1981-82, when I guess I pitched up in Oxford and encountered for the first time the great problem of conventional liberal wisdom in the academic world, I've not been afraid to associate myself with leaders like Thatcher and Reagan. And I think with the benefit of hindsight, one can see just how great their historical achievement was. It's a little bit early for that to be conventionally accepted. In fact, I think we're going through a period in which the Conservatives of the 80s have rather fallen from grace. But, you know, it was an extraordinary feat to turn the economies around of the United States and the United Kingdom. Not all the Western countries had the courage to grasp the economic thorn of reform. The Germans didn't. And nor really did the French. Indeed, the French embarked on one last crazy bout of socialism under François Mitterrand at just the same time. And above all, look at the outcome of the Cold War. It's very easy now to say that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was inevitable, it was bound to happen. It didn't seem like that at the time to me. At the time, it seemed to me that it was the Soviets who were stationing medium-range nuclear weapons throughout Central Europe. At the time, it seemed to me that the ambitions of the Soviet Union globally were, if anything, on the up. So from my point of view, as a young man, as a young student in search of, as it were, a political home, the natural destination was that liberal element that was so important, I think, particularly in Thatcherism. It was, let's face it, it was a kind of alliance between economic liberals and political conservatives, Tories, in the 1980s. And I think I was always more comfortable with the economic liberalism than I was with the Toryism. But I think that's still where you'll find me. And in that sense, I'm very different from Christopher Hitchens, who I think had a kind of road to Damascus experience on 9/11. Well, some of us saw 9/11 coming. We didn't really need to see the menace to the United States laid bare because we already knew exactly how serious it was.
35 minutes left with our guest, Niall Ferguson. We go next to Hattiesburg, Mississippi.
Hello. I have a question for you about a book which I found among my father's things. It's by Lieutenant General Sir John Glubb, G-L-U-B-B, and it is called A Soldier with the Arabs, first, could I ask if you know of that book, and second, could I describe something in it and ask you more about it?
Well, I know of the book. I haven't read it. I'm always honest about these things. Glubb Pasha was, of course, a crucial figure in Britain's Middle Eastern policy because he was one of those imperial soldiers who was prepared to learn and understand not just the language but the culture of the people he was supposedly governing. And the more that Glubb associated with the Arabs of the desert, the more he admired their way of life. In some ways, he romanticized it. I mean, Glubb was somebody who thought of the Arabs as kind of pre-modern, feudal knights, lords, and he was rather attracted to that because he was rather a conservative man who thought Britain was going to the dogs because of all these terrible middle-class chaps. But in a sense, I still have an admiration for Glubb because it seems to me that he did that thing that Americans in equivalent positions today find difficult. He immersed himself in the culture of the people that he was attempting to rule.
So give us your question, Hattiesburg.
Yes, I'm only a little less than halfway through the book. If you are interested in reading it, it was published in '57, so I don't suppose there are too many copies around. And if you're interested in reading it, I'll send it. But the question is this, based on what he says about the war, and for those who are not familiar with him, as I wasn't, he became a general of the Arab Legion, which then involved several other Arab countries over there other than Transjordan, where it started. And in the war with Israel, or what became Israel, he says that there was an awful lot of cheating during the UN truce and bringing in not only ammunition, but weapons, tanks, even airplanes, I think. And I wondered, my view of Israel has always been a sympathetic view to Israel, but this seems to give another side, which sounds like they were really doing bad things.
Well, it's interesting that, I mean, anybody who was involved with the British Army at that time felt understandably menaced by the more extreme proponents of Israeli independence. After all, they were conducting a terrorist war against British troops, and the destruction of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem killed British soldiers. So, somebody from Glubb's generation who, in any case, was sympathetic to the Arab position, as I said, was rather inclined to romanticize the Arab position, naturally reacted in a somewhat hostile way to the more aggressive tactics of the likes of Menachem Begin.
San Francisco, hello, you're next.
Yes, hi. I'd just like to ask if, as an observer of the history of empires, their rise and their fall, you presented with your Colossus concept a very interesting view of the weaknesses in general of the current empire. I'd like to know where would you think this current empire is in terms of its rise and its fall?
Well, the fascinating thing about the American empire is that in many ways its decline is something that it can choose. Because its most important weakness is its attention deficit, its reluctance to make long-term commitments to the countries that it tries to transform, its vulnerabilities really come from within. And I think that is really the biggest cause for disquiet in my mind. It seems to me that it's worth making a parallel here with the Roman Empire. I've talked mainly about the British Empire today, but in fact, in many ways, the American Empire is more Roman than it is British. It's a republic, after all. And a republic has a particular problem with the projection of power to the periphery. It's something that the Romans discovered was ultimately incompatible with the Republican Constitution. This is what Caesar ultimately was all about. And I think the United States finds itself in many ways facing the Roman predicament that its geopolitical impulses to control countries like Iraq and Afghanistan are pointing one way, but its Republican constitutional instincts are pointing in the opposite direction. And I think at the moment we have the spectacle of an electorate that says, we don't like this, we're confused, we've lost faith in the undertaking, let's wind it up. And that electorate is in conflict with the armed forces. You talk to any soldier who's been involved in Iraq, hardly any that I've met, in fact none that I've met, seriously question the legitimacy of the American presence. And indeed most, in fact I'd say all that I've spoken to, this year and last, see it as a viable undertaking. Their only fear is that they're not going to be able to see the job through because of domestic opinion. And in that sense, it seems to me, the American empire is in a sense teetering on the brink with a terrible choice to make between its empire and its traditional Republican instinct to stay home and not get involved.
Daniel Shearforth of Chalfont, Pennsylvania, has this email question. He says, in your book, Empire, you argue that the U.S. does not export enough of its good capital, and which he says he agrees with to a certain extent. You also claim that the cost of expanding our empire would not be prohibitive to the United States. My question is how the United States can export more of its good capital without involving more military-style quagmires, and how the cost would not be prohibitive to the U.S. taxpayer.
Well, one of the surprising things about liberal empire, and here you can compare the United States and Britain quite easily, is that when things are going well, it's a remarkably inexpensive business. The US defense budget is significantly lower today. It's around about 3.5 to 4% of GDP than the defense budget during the Cold War, which was roughly twice that, to say nothing of the world wars. In a sense, global power is not that expensive when you have a huge $10 trillion economy and actually a relatively small number of men and women deployed overseas. Barely, a quarter of a million actually are deployed in foreign theatres at any given time. From that point of view, I think Americans should not worry too much about the cost of nation building. It's actually something that may even pay a dividend. Get Iraq right, and there's going to be an economic dividend for sure. And I don't mean here just oil revenues, because they, I think, will go to the Iraqi people. I mean trade and stability. If you get Iraq right, then the prospects for Middle Eastern stability are greatly enhanced, and America's security is enhanced too. The question of capital export's different. Why should Americans invest anywhere other than in the United States? Why would they want to risk their money in, for example, Iraq, where there are so many political uncertainties? And why would foreign investors resist the allure of Wall Street after so many huge gains in the last decade? In a sense, the world's capital flows quite naturally more into than out of the United States at the moment. And I'm not sure anything really is going to change that for the foreseeable future, unless it is the sustained growth of China, something we haven't talked about, but which, from an imperial historian's point of view, is pretty darn interesting. After all, China is the longest lived of all the great empires. It's basically still the same empire that was doing its stuff back in the 16th, 17th century. And in that sense, if one wants to really talk about the long-term prospects of the United States, one also has to talk about China.
Flatwoods, Kentucky, you're next. Go ahead.
Yes, now, first I got two questions now because you brought up China. Is there ever a threat that China will try to invade the U.S. and take over as part of their own little empire? And also the problems that you all, the British, had in the 20s in Iraq with the Shias and the Sunnis and that whole mess over there. Well, now I'm about to turn 25, and I don't think I'd want to go over there and fight over there and get caught up in that mess between the Shias and Sunnis, because I don't think we will ever calm down that conflict. And I think it's a problem you all had in the 20s, the Shias and Sunnis and the clerics, especially with what we're having in Najaf and Fallujah. Is that true?
Well, thanks for those two excellent questions. I think you can rest easy. The Chinese are, in many ways, more dependent on the United States than the United States is dependent on China. After all, if the U.S. export market doesn't keep on growing, China's economy is going to be in serious difficulty. And also, many of the companies that are currently growing most rapidly in China are in fact recipients of American investment. There's very substantial American foreign direct investment going into China. So relax, I don't think there's a big geopolitical threat from China anytime soon. In fact, I find it very hard to imagine a situation of when that would ever arise, at least in my lifetime. The second point you make is an interesting one, because in the 1920s, it wasn't necessary for Britain to retain the draft to police an empire that covered 25% of the world's land surface. In fact, at the end of the First World War, conscription stopped and the army was largely demobilized. And the number of troops that were actually deployed around the imperial periphery was quite small, about the same number as you have abroad today for the United States. What does that mean? Well, it means that you don't need to worry. I don't think you're going to be drafted anytime soon and sent to fight in Iraq. That's not going to be necessary because there's a fantastically high-quality volunteer army doing the job pretty well right now. And I think that they will do the job better if they are not subject to the kind of rather dubious political restraints that I'm afraid we saw just recently in the case of Fallujah. So I think you can rest easy. I don't think there's a big Chinese threat, and I don't think they're bringing the draft back anytime soon.
Virtual, we're going to go next to, it's Sierra Vista, Arizona. Hello.
Yes, Professor Ferguson. I teach history, and a colleague and I want to use virtual history and counterfactuals for a honors seminar in the fall. Could you provide us any advice about using your text and any experiences you've had in a seminar that would deal with this type of topic?
Well, I think you'll find, and I'm delighted and flattered that this is your intention, I think you and your colleague will find that it's a tremendously stimulating text for honors students. I would tend to, I've always said this to school teachers, to keep it away from younger students, but once you're talking about honors undergraduates, I think you're into the right territory. After all, virtual history was written largely because of my exchanges with several generations of Oxford undergraduates. Most of the questions, like the first one, what if Britain had stayed out in 1914, the first one that I addressed, started in tutorials. It was actually my students who were asking these questions, and I would be initially going, well, I don't know, I never thought of that, and actually we're not supposed to know that. And I gradually came to realize that for younger historians, people who want to enter the subject in the late teens and early 20s, these are the most exciting questions. I think you'll find your students will be quite hard to restrain. They'll be asking you counterfactual questions about everything under the sun before you know it. And so here's a piece of advice. Apply the following rule strictly. All counterfactual speculation, all what-if history has got to be based on alternatives that people considered at the time and wrote about. We need some evidence. It's no good just speculating idly about what might have happened in some completely imaginary scenario. What your students need to look at is what the debates were. For example, just take a case, the Korean War, which isn't in virtual history, but is an important subject in American history. What if MacArthur had been allowed to use the atomic bomb against China in the pursuit of victory in the Korean War? Now, he argued for that, so we know and we can show what the case for that was. And we can also show what the arguments against it were in the Truman administration and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So as long as you root these debates in contemporary debates, as long as you have some evidence there, it can be a hugely stimulating tool. And at the end of it, if you've done the job well, your students will have a better understanding of what did happen, precisely because they've understood why certain things didn't.
Some of the questions that come up in virtual history, so people can have an idea, is what if communism had not collapsed in 1989? You asked the question, what if John F. Kennedy had lived? What if Germany had invaded Britain in May 1940? Just as an example of some of the ones that you chose in this book. Next is Tampa, Florida.
Hello, Mr. Ferguson. Hi. Can you comment on the contribution novelists can make to our understanding history in general, and in specific, I'm thinking of the Radetzky March and Darkness at Noon. And then secondly, you said one of the great weaknesses of the empire is attention deficit disorder. Isn't the fact that the United States has had troops in Korea, Japan, and Europe for over a half century contradict that?
Well, wonderful points. Thank you very much. And happily, these are two books I have read that you mentioned. The Radetzky March and Darkness at Noon, these are wonderful books. No historian who wanted to understand the period about which they're written, say, for example, take Roth's book on the Habsburg monarchy. Nobody can really, it seems to me, write convincingly about that period without reading that book. Why do I think that? After all, these are novels. They're notionally fictional works in the case of the Radetzky March. I think that because historians are ultimately engaged in a strange activity, which is, and Collingwood pointed this out long ago, the reconstruction of past thought. All we're really doing is trying to recover past thought from written and other evidence, and to try to recapture it, to try to work out what exactly was going on in the twilight of the Habsburg monarchy. And I think in that process, the great writers have an invaluable role to play, because in many ways they're answering that question, and they're answering it probably more memorably than many other unpublished sources. The caveat is beware historical fiction. Beware novels written, say, today or last year that purport to be about, Vienna in 1916. Those are, for a historian, the hazardous books, because no matter how well researched they are, they're bound to import anachronistic notions. They're bound, in a sense, to misrepresent the way it actually was. So, for example, when I was working on the First World War, I read and read and read novels written by contemporaries, particularly novels written by participants in the war. And I avoided, like the plague, the books that have been written more recently by people who never so much as heard a gun fired in anger.
Here is the list of fiction books that Niall Ferguson likes the most over years. We'll take a look at that as we take our next call from Norwalk, Connecticut. Hello.
Yes, good afternoon. Great show. Niall, two quick questions. The Roman Empire, Pax Romana, was characterized as a brutal peace. Could the American Empire, Pax Americana, also be characterized as a brutal peace that could, for example, foment the rise of militant Islam? And I refer to people like Chomsky and Chalmers Johnson as authors that maybe would argue that. The second quick question is, as truth is a casualty of war, could it also be a casualty of empire?
Well, thank you for those well-formulated, indeed elegantly formulated questions. I think the key point to remember about empire is again, the alternative. What is the alternative to American intervention in the Middle East? It's not peace and harmony. It is not a kind of touchy-feely paradise in which no violence occurs. After all, coercion was the order of the day under Saddam's regime. We know hundreds of thousands of people were murdered by his tyrannous regime, and we need therefore to understand that the alternative to empire may be something more violent, indeed almost certainly would be something more violent. The key thing is that coercion should be used briefly and effectively to impose credibility, to establish authority, and then attention should turn to creating the institutions of economic and social order, which are far more likely to win people over than any demonstration of force. Ultimately, people need to be incentivized, and I've always felt from the moment that the June 30th date was mentioned for a transition of power, that at that point, the incentive to collaborate with Bremer's coalition provisional authority vanished. After all, why collaborate with an administration that's going to be gone in a matter of weeks? So, I think point number one would be that the Pax Britannica, like the Pax Romana, had its small wars, but compared with the alternatives, compared with how the 19th century might have been in the absence of the British Empire, I think there was less violence than conceivably might have been the case. As for truth, well, truth is principally the victim of totalitarian regimes with no openness. Regimes like Saddam Hussein's that can censor the media, that can strangle opposition. Ultimately, the great advantage of what I call the American Empire is that, like the British Empire before it, at its core is political openness. At its core is the rule of law. At its core is parliamentary or congressional accountability. And I think so far, considering the exigencies of the conflict against terror, this administration has been surprisingly candid about what it's done. And I mentioned earlier the way Bob Woodward's book has cast light on the decision-making process that normally wouldn't be cast until decades after the event. In that sense, I think one shouldn't be too alarmed about the prospects for truth in the American Empire. They're certainly better than the prospects for truth under Saddam Hussein's tyranny.
Houston, hello.
Yeah, I believe that where we made the wrong turn with the empire was when we made the CIA and the secret societies there in this country. We've got two different people running. Now, the American people, I always was a believer that the more we went to other countries, the more people knew us and they loved us, and we loved them. And now we've got a society that's running that we don't know what these people are doing, who's actually in there, calling these shots, and I think that's what's messing the whole thing up.
Well, so, one of the tragedies, perhaps it's not a tragedy, but it may seem like that to many Americans, of power is that it cannot be completely transparent. It is impossible to make a credible and effective foreign policy. It is impossible to gather intelligence and at the same time have complete openness to public scrutiny, and I do think that it's something that Americans don't generally accept. The reality of power must be some limitation on the flow of information. But there's a second point you raise. You expect, and I think you hope, that you, the American people, will be loved abroad. And I think this expectation is a great illusion. It seems to me fundamentally to inhibit the United States to believe that at any point you will be loved for your power. It's not going to happen. The most powerful nation in the world will not be loved by the rest. It will be envied, may even be hated. It comes with the territory. The most the United States can aspire to is respect. If it can achieve respect in the Middle East, then it will have achieved a very great deal. But that is a fragile thing. To expect to be loved may actually be the route to weakness and the loss of that respect.
Terry Hill, New Jersey.
Hi, Dr. Ferguson. Pleasure to talk to you.
Hello.
Earlier, you talked about how American empire was at a crossroads, and part of the reason was it doesn't do much to export its people, its culture, its good, overall goodness, I guess. I was wondering if that same crossroads is accelerated or diminished by its current closeness and the insularity that's beginning to grow.
Well, it's interesting because, of course, some things the United States does export really successfully. And in fact, its popular culture is probably the most successful thing of all. And one shouldn't underestimate the extent to which, without living abroad, without settling abroad, Americans can nevertheless exert a tremendous cultural influence through channels of electronic communication, through movies, through TV, and so forth. And in that sense, I think one has to admire the extraordinary global ambition of American cultural empire. I mean, I have now seen the golden arches of McDonald's, everywhere from Beirut to Bangkok, and there's no question that this is something that the British could not match. I don't think at any point we seriously embarked on fish and chips for the world as a kind of as an aim of imperial strategy. The trouble is that this is what Joseph Nye of Harvard has called soft power. If you export your culture through movies or fast food chains, you don't necessarily convert people to your political position. And I think it's now a commonplace that there are suicide bombers in the Middle East whose bedrooms have on the wall posters of Hollywood stars who wear the American manufactured sneakers. The Yankees cap on the terrorist is a reality, and it shows you that soft power is not real power. And this, I think, is really where the issue of America's deficits cuts in. On culture, you run a surplus. You export far more culture than you import. But the tragedy is, it really doesn't convert that many foreigners to the American way of life.
Boston.
Yes, thank you for taking my call.
Sure.
I had a speculative question. I was wondering if Disraeli were alive today, do you think he would support or be opposed to Ariel Sharon and his government in Israel? And if so, why?
Well, of course, that's an illegitimate counterfactual question because we know that at no point Disraeli seriously addressed the possibility of the creation of a state of Israel. However, I think there is a way for me to answer that helpfully. If you go back to the 1860s and 1870s when Disraeli was at the peak of his power, there was actually really quite a lot of serious discussion in Britain about the prospect of the Jews returning to the Holy Land. And the discussion was primarily animated by evangelicals, just as it is in America today. And the evangelical movement in 19th century Britain, which was so important in shaping debate, strongly believed that Jewish emancipation was part of a wider project that would bring about the return of the diaspora to the Holy Land. Where would Disraeli have stood on this? On the other side. Because the people who believed this were nearly all liberals. If anybody was attracted to this kind of argument, it was Disraeli's arch rival, Gladstone, somebody who I admit to admiring rather more than Disraeli. Disraeli, by contrast, was a believer that the institutions of the Ottoman Empire, corrupt and unsatisfactory though they might be, were ultimately better for Britain's strategic ambitions than any alternative. And Gladstone's constant complaint about Disraeli was that he backed the Ottoman Empire, which was of course essentially an Islamic empire, against the interests not of Jews but of Christians. In fact, the most bitter row that they ever had was about ethnic cleansing by the Turks of Bulgarian, as they were known, Bulgarian Christians in the Balkans. I hope that answers your question. I think it suggests to me that Disraeli would probably not be a particularly hawkish pro-Israelian if he were around today, unless he saw very obvious strategic benefits for Britain in the success of an aggressive Israeli policy towards the Palestinians.
Another book question. This one asked your opinion on Paul Johnson's History of the 20th Century, Modern Times.
Well, I know Paul Johnson well, and I hugely admire him as a journalist. I think he's one of the great Fleet Street writers of his generation. And I also think that his History of the 20th Century has performed a very, very valuable function for many years, because there really wasn't a succinct and effective alternative to a great many rather less satisfactory books, like, for example, Eric Hobsbawm's Age of Extremes, which gives you the 20th century from a Marxist perspective. And I'm afraid, unfortunately, has been rather more influential than Paul Johnson's book, which is, I think, more read here than it is in Great Britain.
Really?
Yeah. The only qualification I have about Paul's book is that the ratio of input to output is quite low, by which I mean there is a really large amount of literature that, judging by his footnotes, he hasn't digested. The book is beautifully written, but it is thinly researched. And I say that with all due respect to him as a writer. He's a very prolific man, and that, as I would be the first to admit, has its costs. I think there could be a better History of the 20th Century written from the same kind of vantage point, and I hope one day that book will be written by someone.
Santa Barbara, hello.
I can't believe that you're talking about Paul Johnson, because my question has to do with a book I was reading of his recently called The Birth of the Modern, and he says the special relationship that we have with Great Britain really begins with the Treaty of Ghent. And it seems now that the relationship, even after 200 years, seems to be getting even more important. And where do you see this relationship and going in the next century, and how important is it going to be to hold the world together?
I'm glad you mentioned The Birth of the Modern, because that's a brilliant book, and it gives me a chance to praise Paul rather more unambiguously than I just did. It's a tremendous work with breathtaking vision and scholarship. What it has to say about the modern world, locating it in that period after the Napoleonic Wars, is very original and stimulating. The special relationship, which is what you ask about, is one of these odd things, because it always seems to me to be much more special to the British than it is to the United States. That's been changed a little bit recently, because Tony Blair has played such a useful role to the United States as really frontman for a policy which American leaders did rather a bad job of selling internationally. And as an asset to the Bush administration, Tony Blair has done a tremendous amount of good. As a British Prime Minister, it seems to me more questionable that he's done good, and I think that would be a view shared by the majority of British voters, who currently feel somewhat disgusted by the predicament in which he's landed Britain. The predicament being, I think, association with a policy that turns out to have been based on rather bogus argumentation, and really nobody argued more speciously about the case for war in Iraq than Blair in the House of Commons, when he not only alleged that there were missiles ready for use in 45 minutes, which implied that somehow British troops would be in danger from conceivably chemical warheads, which simply wasn't true. He also alleged rather subtly in that speech that there was a link from Saddam to Al-Qaeda, which I never believed and clearly wasn't true. Now, he's a tremendous barrister. He has tremendous capacity for making arguments, but I'm afraid he did not do the proper job of a British Prime Minister in the crisis last year, which was to think very seriously about the British national interest and to put that first. I think the special relationship is in large measure an illusion for the United Kingdom. I think the benefits largely flow to the United States, and I do not actually see what it is that the United Kingdom has gained from its support of American foreign policy in the Middle East. I'm still waiting to have it explained to me what will be the payoff. Or is it just the moral satisfaction of having been on the American side when most other European leaders were not? In that sense, I'm a bit of a skeptic about the special relationship, despite the fact that I am a British subject who loves the United States. I think we have to be very careful about assuming that these two countries always have the same interests.
Manhattan, Kansas.
Yes, thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
You mentioned earlier that American support for the war is waning due to the continued violence in Iraq. And we know that the bulk of the responsibility right now is being borne by the U.S. and the U.K. If we had more participation from the international community, not just symbolic, but actual real participation, would that help the American public be supportive of the war? And if so, how can Bush or Kerry, whoever is elected, drum up more support from the UN?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because I think that's where we want to get to. I think we need to internationalize this problem, not only in theory but in practice. We need to have a rather broader peacekeeping presence, not least because the United States Army and Marine Corps are not really terribly experienced at peacekeeping. They're sharp end rather than, as it were, back end military operators. But how do we get there? It may almost be too late to get there. It remains to be seen. At the moment, bringing in Mr. Brahimi as the UN representative seems to me simply to have muddied the waters, because some of what he's said since becoming involved has been so irresponsible and so calculated to inflame Arab opinion. I have no confidence at all in the Iraqi government that he is going to nominate. My sense is that Brahimi does not mean, in fact, any serious commitment of troops from other UN members in the foreseeable future. I think we get all the costs of UN diplomacy with none of the benefits of UN peacekeeping. Now, why? I think that has to be a question about American diplomacy last year. I think we have to ask serious questions about why it was that any kind of hope of an international coalition and real legitimacy for this project crumbled away as it did last year. I don't myself know who has to carry the can for that. Whether we say the State Department was too weak or whether we say the Department of Defense was too strong, at some point last year, reckless decisions were taken that caused a real collapse of the international legitimacy of the undertaking. And having lost that, it's really hard to get it back. I'm not even sure that were he elected, John Kerry would find it very easy to conjure up a real United Nations peacekeeping force, because the attitude, say, of the Germans or of the French today is, it's your mess, you clear it up.
Atlanta, Georgia, hello.
Hi, first I want to say thank you to C-SPAN. You've sparked my interest in history for the past 5 years.
Thank you.
I've read a couple of your books, Mr. Ferguson. The first was the Rothschild book, which I've just found fascinating, and also Empire. And what I wanted to ask you about was your choice of illustrations in Empire was just fabulous. And I wanted to know if you picked the illustrations or if you had help doing that. And secondly, where did you find the Empire Trading Board posters that Great Britain was using, and how did that affect public support for the idea of empire?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because it gives me a chance to praise somebody who doesn't get enough praise. The picture editor at Penguin, Cecilia Mackay, did an absolutely fantastic job of providing a long list of illustrations, from which I then, working with her, picked the ones that got in the book. But she did tremendous work, and I think it's one of the reasons the book is such a wonderfully successful book visually, quite apart from whether my prose works for you. And I do take illustrations seriously. I'm glad you raised this subject, because all too often academic colleagues of mine will dismiss a book with good illustrations as a coffee table book. Why it is that visual evidence is in some sense inferior to literary evidence, I cannot for the life of me think. And I don't think you can really understand the British Empire until you look at its iconography, you look at the images that the British projected of their empire. And I think the book does help to do that, and I'm really grateful to Cecilia for the fantastic stuff she dug up. We agreed between us that we should strive for illustrations that people had not seen. All too often history books churn out the familiar old icons. We wanted to show images that complemented the text, so that one had a clear sense that the illustrations were integrated into the text. I guess I was taking a leaf out of Simon Sharma's book. I think if any historian has shown how art and history can operate together, it's Simon, and I owe a debt to him in that respect. But the answer to the second question about that wonderful poster of imperial trade, that was part of a sustained campaign to understand how the empire was perceived between the wars. before its decline really set in, it had a kind of Indian summer of popularity in Britain, which coincided with the Wembley exhibition in the early 20s. And the poster just seemed perfectly to illustrate this point, that in the 1920s and 30s, the empire seemed a very real going concern.
We have a minute left. I want to just go through your books so that people have one more idea of what they were about. Colossus
is a history of America from the vantage point of an empire.
And prior to that, you wrote Empire?
Which is how to understand Britain's contribution to globalization over 300 years.
And the Cash Nexus.
How does money and power, how do money and power interact, and how do financial institutions shape history?
The 2-volume book on the Rothschilds.
The history of the most powerful financial institution there has ever been.
And Virtual History.
The history of what might have been and how it helps us understand what did happen.
And finally, The Pity of War.
An attempt to understand the First World War, not as a narrative history, but as an analytical history.
And the next one?
Well, I've got 2 things to write in the next couple of years. I'm finishing a biography of a banker named Sigmund Warburg, whose uncle cropped up in our conversation from one of your callers. And then I have a book to write about World War II in the style of the Pity of War, an analytical history of the great mid-20th century crisis. That's next.
And you're leaving New York and going to Boston?
Rather regretfully, because I love New York and I've had a fantastic time at NYU, but I was lured away by the prospect of working with one of the great history departments in the world.
Niall Ferguson, thank you so much. Appreciate your time with us. That's it for In Depth for this month. Thank you for joining us too.
Next month on In Depth, Harold Holzer. The Lincoln Scholar will consider his complete body of work, including the Confederate image, the Lincoln image, the President